welcome to Story Rhyme with Brendan, where I read a story or a poem for you. This time I'll read chapters 16 to 19 of the book called A Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson by Watkin Tench. This book is about the founding years of the Port Jackson settlement. Well, let's continue. Chapter 16. Transactions of the colony until the 18th of December 1791, when I quitted it, with an account of its state at that time. The Gorgon had arrived on the 21st of September, and the hour of departure to England, for the Marine Battalion drew nigh. If I be allowed to speak from my own feelings on the occasion, I will not say that we contemplated its approach with mingled sensations. We hailed it with rapture and exultation. The Supply, ever the harbinger of welcome and glad tidings, proclaimed by her own departure that ours was at hand. On the 26th of November she sailed for England. It was impossible to view our separation with insensibility. The little ship, which had so often agitated our hopes and fears, which from long acquaintance we had learned to regard as part of ourselves, whose doors of hospitality had been ever thrown open to relieve our accumulated wants and chase our solitary gloom. December 1791. In consequence of the offers made to the non-commissioned officers and privates of the Marine Battalion to remain in the country as settlers, or to enter into the New South Wales Corps, 3 corporals, 1 drummer, and 59 privates accepted of grants of land to settle at Norfolk Island and Rose Hill, Parramatta. Of these men, several were undoubtedly possessed of sufficient skill and industry, by the assistance of the pay which was due to them from the date of their embarkation in the beginning of the year 1787. To the day on which they were discharged, to set out with reasonable hopes of being able to procure a maintenance. But the only apparent reason to which the behaviour of a majority of them could be ascribed was from infatuated affection to female convicts, whose characters and habits of life, I am sorry to say, promise from a connection neither honour nor tranquillity. The narrative part of this work will, I conceive, be best brought to a termination by a description of the existing state of the colony, as taken by myself a few days previous to my embarkation in the Gorgon to set for England. December 2nd, 1791. Went up to Rose Hill. Public buildings here have not greatly multiplied since my last survey. The storehouse and barrack have been long completed, also apartments for the chaplain of the regiment and for the judge advocate, in which last criminal courts, when necessary, are held. But these are petty erections. In a colony which contains only a few hundred hovels, built of twigs and mud, we feel consequential enough already to talk of a treasury, an admiralty, a public library, and many other similar edifices, which are to form part of a magnificent square. The great road from near the landing place to the governor's house is finished, and a very noble one it is, being of great breadth and a mile long in a straight line. In many places it is carried over gullies of considerable depth, which have been filled up with trunks of trees covered with earth. All the sawyers and carpenters and blacksmiths will soon be concentrated under the direction of a very adequate person of the governor's household. This plan is already so far advanced as to contain 9 covered saw pits, which change of weather cannot disturb the operations of, an excellent work shed for the carpenters, and a large new shop for the blacksmiths. It certainly promises to be of great public benefit. A new hospital has been talked of for the last 2 years, but it is not yet begun. 2 long sheds, built in the form of a tent and thatched, are however finished and capable of holding 200 patients. The sick list of today contains 382 names. Rose Hill, Parramatta, is less healthy than it used to be. The prevailing disorder is a dysentery, which often terminates fatally. There was lately one very violent putrid fever, which, by timely removal of a patient, was prevented from spreading. 25 men and 2 children died here in the month of November. When at the hospital, I saw and conversed with some of the Chinese travellers. 4 of them lay here, wounded by the natives. I asked these men if they really supposed it possible to reach China. They answered that they were certainly made to believe, they knew not how, that at a considerable distance to the northward existed a large river, which separated this country from the back part of China, and that when it should be crossed, which was practicable, they would find themselves among a copper-coloured people, who would receive and treat them kindly. They added that on the third day of their elopement, one of the party died of fatigue. Another they saw butchered by the natives, who, finding them unarmed, attacked them and put them to flight. This happened near Broken Bay, which harbour stopped their progress to the northward and forced them to turn to the right hand, by which means they soon after found themselves on the seashore, where they wandered about in a destitute condition, picking up shellfish to allay hunger. Deeming the further prosecution of their scheme impracticable, several of them agreed to return to Rose Hill, which with difficulty they accomplished, arriving almost famished. On their road back they met 6 fresh adventurers, sallying forth to join them, to whom they related what had passed, and persuaded them to relinquish their intention. There are at this time not less than 38 convict men missing, who live in the woods by day and at night enter the different farms and plunder for subsistence. December 3rd, 1791. Began my survey of the cultivated land belonging to the public. The harvest has commenced. They are reaping both wheat and barley. The field between the barrack and the governor's house contains wheat and maize, both very bad, but the former particularly so. In passing through the main street, I was pleased to observe the gardens of the convicts looked better than I had expected to find them. The vegetables in general are but mean, but the stalks of maize with which they are interspersed appear green and flourishing. The semicircular hill, which sweeps from the overseer of the cattle's house to the governor's house, is planted with maize, which, I am told, is the best here. It certainly looks in most parts very good, stout, thick stalks with large spreading leaves, but I am surprised to find it so backward. It is at least a month later than that in the gardens at Sydney. Behind the maize is a field of wheat, which looks tolerably for this part of the world. It will, I reckon, about 12 bushels an acre. Continued my walk and looked at a little patch of wheat in the governor's garden, which was sown in drills, the ground being first mixed with clay, which its discoverers pretended was marl. Whatever it be, this experiment bespeaks not much in favour of its enriching qualities, for the corn looks miserably and is far exceeded by some neighbouring spots, on which no such advantage has been bestowed. Went round the crescent at the bottom of the garden, which certainly in beauty of form and situation is unrivalled in New South Wales. Here are 8,000 vines planted, all of which in another season are expected to bear grapes. Besides the vines are several small fruit trees, which were brought in the Gorgon from the Cape, and look lively. On one of them are 6 apples, as big as nutmegs. Although the soil of the crescent be poor, its aspects and circular figure, so advantageous for receiving and retaining the rays of the sun, eminently fit it for a vineyard. Passed the rivulet and looked at the corn land on its northern side. On the western side of Clark's house, the wheat and maize are bad, but on the eastern side is a field supposed to be the best in the colony. I thought it of good height, and the ears well filled, but it is far from thick. While I was looking at it, Clark came up. Side note: Dodd, who is mentioned in my former journal of this place, had died some months ago, and Mr. Clark was put in his room. He is one of the superintendents, sent out by government, on a salary of £40 per annum. That's about £5,000 in today's money, 10 grand Australian, so not much. He was bred to husbandry under his father at Lewes in Sussex, and is, I conceive, competent to his office of principal conductor of the agriculture of Rose Hill. Back to the main text. I told him I thought he would reap 15 or 16 bushels an acre. 15 bushels is about 540 litres, or a bit over 1.5 bathtubs full. He seemed to think 17 or 18. I have now inspected all the European corn. A man of so little experience of these matters as myself cannot speak with much confidence. Perhaps the produce may average 10 bushels an acre, or 12 at the outside. Allowance should, however, be made in estimate the quality of the soil, for the space occupied by roots of trees, for inadequate culture, and in some measure to want of rain, less have fallen than was wished. But this spring was by no means so dry as the last. I find that the wheat grows at Rose Hill last year weighed 57 pounds and a half per bushel. So again, a bushel is about a third of a kitchen sink. My next visit was to the cattle, which consists of 2 stallions, 6 mares and 2 colts, besides 16 cows, 2 cow calves, and 1 bull calf, which were brought out by the Gorgon. 2 bulls, which were on board, died on the passage, so that on the young gentleman just mentioned depends the stocking of the colony. The period of the inhabitants of New South Wales being supplied with animal food of their own raising is too remote for a prudent man to calculate. The cattle look in good condition, and I was surprised to hear that neither corn nor fodder is given to them. The enclosures in which they are confined furnish hardly a blade of grass at present. There are people appointed to tend them, who have been used to this way of life, and who seem to execute it very well. Sunday, December 4th, 1791. Divine service is now performed here every Sunday, either by the chaplain of the settlement or the chaplain of the regiment. I went to church today. Several hundred convicts were present, the majority of whom I thought looked the most miserable beings in the shape of humanity I ever beheld. They appeared to be worn down with fatigue. December 5th. Made excursions this day to view the public settlements. Reached the first, which is about a mile in a northwest direction from the governor's house. This settlement contains, by admeasurement, 134 acres, a part of which is planted with maize, very backward, but in general tolerably good, and beautifully green. 13 large huts, built in the form of a tent, are erected for the convicts who work here, but I could not learn the number of these last, being unable to find a superintendent or any person who could give me information. Ponds of water here sufficient to supply 1,000 persons. Walked on to the second settlement, about 2 miles further, through an uncleared country. Here met Davigny, the person who planned and now superintends all the operations carried on here. He told me he estimated the quantity of cleared ground here to be 300 acres. He certainly overrates it 1/3, by the judgment of every other person. 6 weeks ago this was a forest. It has been cleared, and the wood nearly burnt off the ground by 500 men, in the before-mentioned period, or rather in 30 days, for only that number have the convicts worked. He said it is too late to plant maize, and therefore he should sow turnips, which would help to meliorate and prepare it for next year. On examining the soil, I thought it in general light, though in some places loamy to the touch. He means to try the Rose Hill marl upon it, with which he thinks it will incorporate well. I hope it will succeed better than the experiment in the governor's garden. I wished to know whether he had chosen this ground simply from the conveniency of its situation to Rose Hill and its easy form of tillage, and having water, or from any marks which he had thought indicated good soil. He said that what I had mentioned no doubt weighed with him, and that he judged the soil to be good from the limbs of many of the trees growing on it being covered with moss. Ah, said I, your 500 men still complete?
No, this day's muster gave only 460. The rest are either sick and removed to the hospital, or are run away in the woods.
How much is each labourer's daily task?
7 rods, it was 8. But on their representing to the governor that it was beyond their strength to execute, he took off 1.
13 large huts, similar to those before mentioned, contain all the people here. To every hut are appointed 2 men, as hut keepers, whose only employment is to watch the huts in working hours, to prevent them from being robbed. This has somewhat checked depredations, and those endless complaints of the convicts, that they could not work, because they had nothing to eat, their allowance being stolen. The working hours at this season, summer, are from 5 o'clock in the morning until 10, rest from 10 to 2, return to work at 2, and continue till sunset. This surely cannot be called very severe toil, but on the other hand must be remembered the inadequacy of a ration of salt provisions, with few vegetables and unassisted by any liquor but water. Here finished my remarks on everything of a public nature at Rose Hill, but having sufficient time, I determined to visit all the private settlers to inspect their labours, and learn from them their schemes, their hopes and expectations. In pursuance of my resolution, I crossed the country to Prospect Hill, at the bottom of which lived the following 13 convicts, who have accepted allotments of ground and are become settlers. So it's a table of the people. So first column's the men's name, what their trade is, the number of acres of their allotments, and then finally the number of those acres that are cultivated. John Silverthorne, weaver, 40 acres, 1 3/4. Thomas Martin, ditto, a weaver, 40 acres, 1 1/2 cultivated. John Nicholas, gardener, 40 acres, 2 cultivated. William Butler and his wife, he's a seaman, 50 acres, 4 acres cultivated. Side note, in partnership with William Lisk, a watchmaker, he has 40 acres, and that cultivated joined 4 acres. William Parrish, wife and a child, is a seaman, 60 acres, 2 3/4 cultivated. William Kilby and his wife, a husbandman, 60 acres, 1 3/4 cultivated. Edward Pugh, wife and 2 children, carpenter, 70 acres allotted, 2 1/2 cultivated. Samuel Griffith, butcher, 40 acres allotted, 1 1/2 cultivated. John Herbert, side note, not out of his time, but allowed to work here at his leisure hours, as he has declared his intention of settling, so he's got nothing. Then James Castle, husbandman, 40 acres, 2 cultivated. Joseph Marlowe, in a similar predicament with Herbert, so he's allowed to work here at leisures, but nothing allotted yet. And then John Williams and his wife, carpenter, 50 acres allotted and 1 that's cultivated. On terms on which these allotments have been granted are that the estates shall be fully ceded forever to all who shall continue to cultivate for 5 years or more, that they shall be free of all taxes for the first 10 years, but after that period to pay an annual quit rent of 1 shilling. The penalty of non-performance of any of these articles is forfeiture of the estate and all the labour which may have been bestowed upon it. These people are to receive provisions, the same quantity as the working convicts, clothes and medicinal assistance for 18 months from the day on which they settled. To clear and cultivate the land, a hatchet, a tomahawk, 2 hoes, a spade and a shovel are given to each person, whether man or woman, and a certain number of cross-cut saws among the whole. To stock their farms, 2 sow pigs were promised to each settler, but they almost all say they have not yet received any, of which they complain loudly. They all received grain to sow and plant for the first year. They settled here in July and August last. Most of them were obliged to build their own houses, and wretched hovels 3/4 of them are. Should any of them fall sick, the rest are bound to assist the sick person 2 days in a month, provided the sickness lasts not longer than 2 months. 4 days' labour in each year, from every person being all that he is entitled to. To give protection to this settlement, a corporal and 2 soldiers are encamped in the centre of the farms, as the natives once attacked the settlers and burnt one of their houses. These guards are, however, inevitably at such a distance from some of the farms as to be unable to afford them any assistance in case of another attack. With all these people I conversed and inspected their labours. Some I found tranquil and determined to persevere, provided encouragement should be given. Others were in a state of despondency, and predicted that they should starve, unless the period of 18 months, during which they are to be clothed and fed, should be extended to 3 years. The cultivation is yet in its infancy, and therefore opinions should not be hastily formed of what it may arrive at. With moderate skill and industry, they have at present little in the ground beside maize, and that looks not very promising. Some small patches of wheat, which I saw, are miserable indeed. The greatest part of the land, I think, but indifferent, being light and stony. Of the 13 farms, 10 are unprovided with water, and at some of them they are obliged to fetch this necessary article from the distance of 1.5 miles. All the settlers complain sadly of being frequently robbed by the runaway convicts, who plunder them incessantly. December 6th. Visited the settlements to the northward of the rivulet. The nearest of them lies about a mile, 1.6 k's, due north of Mr. Clark's house. Here are only the undernamed 5 settlers. So below is another table. Men's names, first column, the trade, number of the acres in each allotment, and then number of acres in cultivation. And the first one, Thomas Brown, wife and child. Trades, nothing, so farmers. 60 acres allotted and cultivated in joint with the 2 names below it, 3.5 acres cultivated. William Bradbury, also a farmer, 30 acres allotted. William Mould, 30 acres allotted. So yeah, they're all those 3 in total, 3.5 acres cultivated. Then Simon Byrne and wife, hosier, 50 acres allotted and 3 cultivated. Simon Parr and wife, merchant's clerk, 50 acres allotted, 3.5 cultivated. These settlers are placed on the same footing in every respect which concerns their tenure and the assistance to be granted to them as those at Prospect Hill. Near them is water. Parr and Byrne are men of great industry. They have both good houses, which they hired people to build for them. Parr told me that he had expended 13 guineas on his land. That's about £1,700 in today's money, or about $3,000 Australian, which nevertheless he does not seem pleased with. Of the 3 poor fellows who work in partnership, one, Bradbury, is runaway. This man had been allowed to settle on a belief from his own assurance that his term of transportation was expired, but it was afterwards discovered that he had been cast for life. Hereupon he grew desperate and declared he would rather perish at once than remain as a convict. He disappeared a week ago and has never since been heard of. Were I compelled to settle in New South Wales, I should fix my residence here, both from the appearance of the soil and its proximity to Rose Hill. A corporal and 2 privates are encamped here to guard the settlement, as at Prospect. Proceeded to the settlement called the Ponds, a name which I suppose it derived from several ponds of water which are near the farms. Here reside the 14 following settlers. Thomas Kelly, a servant, 30 acres allotted, 1.5 cultivated. And William Hubbard and wife, a plasterer, 50 acres allotted, 2.25 cultivated. Curtis Brand and wife, carpenter, 50 acres allotted, 3 cultivated. John Ramsey and wife, seaman, 50 acres and 3.5. William Field, it's just got a dash, so it might be the same as above, seaman or maybe a farmer. 30 acres allotted, 2.5 cultivated. John Riches, stonecutter, 30 acres and 4.5, it's got a side note, cultivated in partnership with John Summers, husbandman, 30 acres allotted, and yeah, shared as above. John Varnell, another line, so husbandman maybe, 30 acres and 1 cultivated. Anthony Rope and wife and 2 children. Bricklayer, 70 acres and 1 side note, a convict who means to settle here and is permitted to work in his leisure hours. Joseph Bishop and wife, trades, none. 50 acres allotted, 1.5 cultivated. Matthew Everingham and wife, attorney's clerk, 50 acres allotted, 2 cultivated. John Anderson and wife, I guess another attorney's clerk, 50 acres allotted, 2 cultivated. Edward Elliott, husbandman, 30 acres allotted in partnership, cultivated 2 with Joseph Marshall, a weaver. The Prospect Hill terms of settlement extend to this place. My private remarks were not many. Some spots which I passed over I thought desirable, particularly Ramsay's farm, and he deserves a good spot, for he is a civil, sober, industrious man. Besides his cornland, he has a well laid out little garden, in which I found him and his wife busily at work. He praised her industry to me, and said he did not doubt of succeeding. It is not often seen that sailors make good farmers, but this man, I think, bids fair to contradict the observation. The gentleman of no trade, his own words to me, will, I apprehend, at the conclusion of the time when victualling from the store is to cease, have the honour of returning to drag a timber or brick cart for his maintenance. The little maize he has planted is done in so slovenly a style as to promise a very poor crop. He who looks forward to eat grapes from his own vine, and to sit under the shade of his own fig tree, must labour in every country. Here he must exert more than ordinary activity. The attorney's clerk I also thought out of his province. I dare believe that he finds cultivating his own land not half so easy a task as he formerly found that of stringing together volumes of tautology to encumber, or convey away that of his neighbour. Hubbard's farm and Kelly's also deserve regard, from being better managed than most of the others. The people here complain sadly of a destructive grub, which destroys the young plants of maize. Many of the settlers have been obliged to plant twice, nay thrice on the same land, from the depredations of these reptiles. There is the same guard here as at the other settlements. Nothing now remains for inspection but the farms on the riverside. December 7th. Went to Sheffer's farm. I found him at home, conversed with him, and walked with him over all his cultivated ground. He had 140 acres granted to him, 14 of which are in cultivation, 12 in maize, 1 in wheat, and 1 in vines and tobacco. He has besides 23 acres, on which the trees are cut down, but not burnt off the land. He resigned his appointment and began his farm last May, and had at first 5 convicts to assist him. He has now 4. All his maize, except 3 acres, is mean. This he thinks may be attributed to 3 causes: a middling soil, too dry a spring, and from the ground not being sufficiently pulverized before the seed was put into it. The wheat is thin and poor. He does not reckon its produce at more than 8 or 9 bushels. His vines, 900 in number, are flourishing and will, he supposes, bear fruit next year. His tobacco plants are not very luxuriant. To these 2 last articles he means principally to redirect his exertions. He says, and truly, that they will always be saleable and profitable. On one of the boundaries of his land is plenty of water. A very good brick house is nearly completed for his use by the governor, and in the meantime he lives in a very decent one, which was built for him on his settling here. He is to be supplied with provisions from the public store, and with medical assistance for 18 months, reckoning from last May. At the expiration of this period, he is bound to support himself, and the 4 convicts are to be withdrawn. But if he shall then, or at any future period, declare himself able to maintain a moderate number of these people for their labour, they will be assigned to him. Mr. Sheffer is a man of industry and respectable character. He came out to this country as a superintendent of convicts at a salary of £40 per annum, and brought with him a daughter of 12 years old. He is by birth a Hessian and served in America in a corps of Jaegers with the rank of lieutenant. He never was professionally in any part of life a farmer, but he told me that his father owned a small estate on the banks of the Rhine, on which he resided, and that he had always been fond of looking at and assisting in his labours, particularly in the vineyard. In walking along, he more than once shook his head and made some mortifying observations on the soil of his present domain, compared with the banks of his native stream. He assured me that, exclusive of the sacrifice of his salary, he has expended more than £40 in advancing his ground to the state in which I saw it. Of the probability of success in his undertaking, he spoke with moderation and good sense. Sometimes he said he had almost despaired, and had often balanced about relinquishing it, but had as often been checked by recollecting that hardly any difficulty can arise, which vigour and perseverance will not overcome. I asked him what was the tenure on which he held his estate. He offered to show the written document, saying that it was exactly the same as Roos's. I therefore declined to trouble him, and took my leave with wishes for his success and prosperity. Near Mr. Sheffer's farm is a small patch of land cleared by Lieutenant Townsend of the New South Wales Corps, about 2 acres of which are in maize and wheat, both looking very bad. Proceeded to the farm of Mr. Arndell, one of the assistant surgeons. This gentleman has 6 acres in cultivation as follows: rather more than 4 in maize, 1 in wheat, and the remainder in oats and barley. The wheat looks tolerably good, rather thin, but of a good height, and the ears well filled. His farming servant guesses the produce will be 12 bushels. Side note: I have received a letter from Port Jackson, dated in April 1792, which states that the crop of wheat turned out 15 bushels, and the maize rather more than 40 bushels. Back to the main text. And I do not think he overrates it. The maize he guesses at 30 bushels, which from appearances it may yield, but not more. The oats and barley are not contemptible. This ground has been turned up but once. The aspect of it is nearly south, on a declivity of the river, or arm of the sea, on which Rose Hill stands. It was cleared of wood about 9 months ago, and sown this year for the first time. December 8th. Went this morning to the farm of Christopher Magee, a convict settler nearly opposite to that of Mr. Sheffer. The situation of this farm is very eligible, provided the river in floods does not inundate it, which I think doubtful. This man was bred in husbandry, and lived 8 years in America. He has no less than 8 acres in cultivation, 5½ in maize, 1 in wheat, and 1½ in tobacco. From the wheat he does not expect more than 10 bushels, but he is extravagant enough to rate the produce of maize at 100 bushels. That's 1/3 of a bathtub. Perhaps he may get 50. On tobacco he means to go largely hereafter. He began to clear this ground in April, but did not settle until last July. I asked by what means he had been able to accomplish so much. He answered, by industry, and by hiring all the convicts I could get to work in their leisure hours, besides some little assistance which the governor has occasionally thrown in. His greatest impediment is want of water, being obliged to fetch all he uses more than half a mile. He sunk a well and found water, but it was brackish, and not fit to drink. If this man shall continue in habits of industry and sobriety, I think him sure of succeeding. Reached Roos's farm. Side note: see the state of this farm in my former Rose Hill journal of November 1790, 13 months before, and begged to look at his grant, the material part of which runs thus: a lot of 30 acres to be called Experiment Farm. The said lot to be holden, free of all taxes, quit rents, etc., for 10 years, provided that the occupier, his heirs, or assigns shall reside within the same and proceed to the improvement thereof, reserving, however, for the use of the Crown all timber now growing, or which hereafter shall grow, fit for naval purposes. At the expiration of 10 years, an annual quit rent of 1 shilling shall be paid by the occupier in acknowledgement. Roos now lives in a comfortable brick house, built for him by the governor. He has 11 acres and a half in cultivation, and several more which have been cleared by convicts in their leisure hours, on condition of receiving the first year's crop. He means to cultivate little besides maize. Wheat is so much less productive. Of the culture of vineyards and tobacco he is ignorant, and with great good sense. He declared that he would not quit the path he knew for an uncertainty. His livestock consists of 4 breeding sows and 30 fowls. He has been taking from the store, that is, has supplied himself with provisions for some months past, and his wife is to be taken off at Christmas, at which time, if he deems himself able to maintain a convict labourer, one is to be given to him. Crossed the river in a boat to Robert Webb's farm. This man was one of the seamen of the Sirius, and has taken in conjunction with his brother, also a seaman of the same ship, a grant of 60 acres, on the same terms as Ruse, save that the annual quit rent is to commence at the expiration of 5 years, instead of 10. The brother is gone to England to receive the wages due to them both for their services, which money is to be expended by him in whatever he judges will be most conducive to the success of their plan. Webb expects to do well, talks as a man should talk who has just set out on a doubtful enterprise, which he is bound to pursue. He is sanguine in hope and looks only at the bright side of the prospect. He has received great encouragement and assistance from the governor. He has 5 acres cleared and planted with maize, which looks thriving and promises to yield a decent crop. His house and a small one adjoining for pigs and poultry were built for him by the governor, who also gave him 2 sows and 7 fowls, to which he adds a little stock of his own acquiring. Near Webb is placed William Reed, another seaman of the Sirius, on the same terms, and to whom equal encouragement has been granted. My survey of Rose Hill is now closed. I have inspected every piece of ground in cultivation here, both public and private, and have written from actual examination only. But before I bade adieu to Rose Hill, in all probability for the last time of my life, it struck me that there yet remained one object of consideration not to be slighted. Barrington had been in the settlement between 2 and 3 months, and I had not seen him. I saw him with curiosity. He is tall, approaching 6 feet, slender, and his gait and manner bespeak liveliness and activity. Of that elegance and fashion with which my imagination had decked him, I know not why, I could distinguish no trace. Great allowance should, however, be made for depression and unavoidable deficiency of dress. His face is thoughtful and intelligent. To a strong cast of countenance he adds a penetrating eye and a prominent forehead. His whole demeanour is humble, not servile. Both on his passage from England and since his arrival here, his conduct has been irreproachable. He is appointed High Constable of the settlement of Rose Hill, a post of some respectability, and certainly one of importance to those who live here. His knowledge of men, particularly of that part of them into whose morals, manners, and behaviour he is ordered especially to inspect, eminently fit him for the office. I cannot quit him without bearing my testimony, that his talents promise to be directed in future to make reparation to society for the offences he has heretofore committed against. The number of persons of all descriptions at Rose Hill at this period will be seen in the following return. A return of the number of persons at Rose Hill, 3rd of December, 1791. So the table has a few columns. First is quality, the next is men, then women, then children into 3 groups. Of 10 years, of 2 years, and under a year. So convict row, side note, the convicts who are become settlers are included in this number. 1,336 men, 133 women, 9 kids of 2 years, 17 under a year. Troops, 94 men, 9 women, 1 kid over 10 years, 5 of 2 years, 2 under 2 years. Civil Department, 7 men. Seamen settlers, 3 men. Free persons, it's got no men. 7 women, 2 kids of 10 years, 1 of 2 years, 2 under 2. Total number of persons, 1,628. That's 1,444 men, 149 women, 3 kids of 10 years, 15 kids of 2 years, and 21 kids under 2 years. Of my Sydney journal, I find no part sufficiently interesting to be worth extraction. This place had long been considered only as a depot for stores. It exhibited nothing but a few old scattered huts and some sterile gardens. Cultivation of the ground was abandoned, and all our strength transferred to Rose Hill. Sydney, nevertheless, continued to be the place of the governor's residence, and consequently the headquarters of the colony. No public building of note except a storehouse had been erected since my last statement. The barracks, so long talked of, so long promised for the accommodation and discipline of the troops, were not even begun. When I left the country, and instead of a new hospital, the old one was patched up, and with the assistance of one brought ready framed from England, served to contain the sick. December 1791. The employment of the male convicts here, as at Rose Hill, was the public labour. Of the women, the majority were compelled to make shirts, trousers, and other necessary parts of dress for the men from materials delivered to them from the stores, into which they returned every Saturday night the produce of their labour, a stipulated weekly task being assigned to them. In a more early stage, government sent out all articles of clothing ready-made, but by adopting the present judicious plan, not only a public saving is effected, but employment of a suitable nature created for those who would otherwise consume leisure in idle pursuits only. On the 26th of November, 1791, the number of persons of all descriptions at Sydney was 1,259, of which, if 1,628 at Rose Hill and 1,172 at Norfolk Island be added, the total number of persons in New South Wales and its dependency will be found to amount to 4,059. Side note: a very considerable addition to this number has been made since I quitted the settlement, by fresh troops and convicts sent thither from England. Back to the main text. On the 13th of December, 1791, the Marine Battalion embarked on board His Majesty's ship Gorgon, and on the 18th sailed for England. Chapter 17. Miscellaneous remarks on the country, on its vegetable productions, on its climate, on its animal productions, on its natives, etc. The journals contained in the body of this publication, illustrated by the map which accompanies it, are, I conceive, so descriptive of every part of the country known to us, that little remains to be added beyond a few general observations. The first impression made on a stranger is certainly favourable. He sees gentle, swelling hills, connected by vales which possess every beauty that verdure of trees and form, simply considered in itself, can produce. But he looks in vain for those murmuring rills and refreshing springs, which fructify and embellish more happy lands. Nothing like those tributary streams which feed rivers in other countries are here seen. For when I speak of the stream at Sydney, I mean only the drain of a morass, and the river at Rose Hill is a creek of the harbour, which above high water mark would not in England be called even a brook. Whence the Hawkesbury, the only freshwater river known to exist in the country, derives its supply, would puzzle a transient observer. He sees nothing but turbid, unmeaning ponds, often stagnant and always still, unless agitated by heavy rains, which communicate with it. Doubtless the springs which arise in Carmarthen Mountains may be said to constitute its source, to cultivate its banks within many miles of the bed of the stream, which on some elevated detached spots will be found impracticable unless some method be devised of erecting a mound sufficient to repel the encroachments of a torrent, which sometimes rises 50 feet above its ordinary level, inundating the surrounding country in every direction. The country between the Hawkesbury and Rose Hill is that which I have hitherto spoken of. When the river is crossed, this prospect soon gives place to a very different one. The green vales and moderate hills disappear, at the distance of about 3 miles from the river side, and from Night Hill and Mount Twist. Side note, look at the map, okay? So this is the map at the start of the book. It's not on the Google Maps scan. That's the Carmarthen Mountains. As it's got Port Jackson, Rose Hill, there's Broken Bay, Botany Bay down the bottom, supposed course of the Nepean, the limits which terminate our researches. Nothing but precipices, wilds and deserts are to be seen. Even these steeps fail to produce streams. The difficulty of penetrating this country, joined to the dread of a sudden rise of the Hawkesbury, forbidding all return, has hitherto prevented our reaching Carmarthen Mountains. Let the reader now cast his eye on the relative situation of Port Jackson. He will see it cut off from communication with the northward of Broken Bay, and with the southward by Botany Bay, and what is worse, the whole space of intervening country yet explored, except a narrow strip called the Kangaroo Ground, in both directions is so bad as to preclude cultivation. The course of the Hawkesbury will next attract his attention. To the southward of every part of Botany Bay we have traced this river, but how much farther in that line it extends we know not. Hence its channel takes a northerly direction, and finishes its course in Broken Bay, running at the back of Port Jackson in such a manner as to form the latter into a peninsula. The principal question then remaining is, what is the distance between the head of Botany Bay and the part of Hawkesbury nearest to it? And is the intermediate country a good one, or does it lead to one which appearances indicate to be good? The future adventurers who shall meet with more encouragement to persevere and discover than I and my fellow wanderer did, I resign the answer. In the meantime, the reader is desired to look at the remarks on the map, which were made in the beginning of August 1790, from Pyramid Hill, which bounded our progress on the southern expedition, when, and when only, this part of the country has been seen. It then follows that from Rose Hill to within such a distance of the Hawkesbury as it protected from its inundations, is the only tract of land we yet know of, in which cultivation can be carried on for many years to come. To aim at forming a computation of the distance of time, of the labour, and of the expense which would attend forming distinct convict settlements beyond the bounds I have delineated, or of the difficulty which would attend a system of communication between such establishments as Port Jackson, is not intended here. Until that period shall arrive, the progress of cultivation, when it shall have once passed Prospect Hill, will probably steal along to the southward in preference to the northward, from the superior nature of the country in that direction, as the remarks inserted in the map will testify. Such is my statement of a plan which I deem inevitably entailed on the settlement at Port Jackson. In sketching this outline of it, let it not be objected that I suppose the reader as well acquainted with the respective names and boundaries of the country as long residents, and unwearied journeying among them, have made the author. To have subjoined perpetual explanations would have been tedious and disgusting. Familiarity with the relative positions of a country can neither be imparted or acquired, but by constant recurrence to geographic delineations. On the policy of settling, with convicts only, a country at once so remote and extensive, I shall offer no remarks. Whenever I have heard this question agitated since my return to England, the cry of, "What can we do with them? Where else can they be sent?" has always silenced me. Of the soil, opinions have not differed widely. A spot eminently fruitful has never been discovered. That there are many spots cursed with everlasting and unconquerable sterility, no one who has seen the country will deny. At the last time I am decidedly of opinion that many large tracts of land between Rose Hill and the Hawkesbury, even now, are of a nature sufficiently favourable to produce moderate crops of whatever may be sown in them, and provided a sufficient number of cattle be imported to afford manure for dressing the ground, no doubt can exist that subsistence for a limited number of inhabitants may be drawn from. Side note: in my former narrative, I have particularly noticed the sudden disappearance of the cattle, which we had brought with us into the country. Not a trace of them has ever since been observed. The fate is a riddle, so difficult of solution that I shall not attempt it. Surely had they stayed inland in some of our numerous excursions, marks on them must have been found. It is equally impossible to believe that either the convicts or natives killed and ate them, without some sign of detection ensuing. Back to the main text. To imperfect husbandry and dry seasons must indubitably be attributed part of the deficiency of former years. Hitherto, all our endeavours to derive advantage from mixing the different soils have proved fruitless, though possibly only from want of skill on our side. The spontaneous productions of the soil will be soon recounted. Every part of the country is a forest. Of the quality of the wood, take the following instance. The supply wanted wood for a mast, and more than 40 of the choicest young trees were cut down before as much wood as would make it could be procured, the trees being either rotten at the heart or riven by the gum which abounds in them. This gum runs not always in the longitudinal direction in the body of the trees, but is found in its circles like a scroll. There is, however, a species of lightwood which is found excellent for boat building, but it is scarce and hardly ever found of large size. To find limestone, many of our researches were directed, but after repeated essays with fire and chemical preparations on all the different sorts of stone to be picked up, it is still a desideratum. Nor did my experiments with a magnet induce me to think that any of the stones I tried contained iron. I have, however, heard other people report very differently on this head. The list of esculent vegetables, as edible, and wild fruits is too contemptible to deserve notice. If the sweet tea, whose virtues have been already recorded, and the common orchis root be expected, that species of palm tree which produces the mountain cabbage is also found in most of the freshwater swamps within 6 or 7 miles of the coast, but is rarely seen further inland. Even the banks of the Hawkesbury are unprovided with it. The inner part of the trunk of this tree was greedily eaten by our hogs, and formed their principal support. The grass, as has been remarked in former publications, does not overspread the land in a continued sward, but arises in small detached tufts, growing every way about 3 inches apart, the intermediate space being bare, though the heads of the grass are often so luxuriant as to hide all deficiency on the surface. The rare and beautiful flowering shrubs, which abound in every part, deserve the highest admiration and panegyric. Of the vegetable productions transplanted from other climes, maize flourishes beyond any other grain, and as it affords a strong and nutritive article of food, its propagation will, I think, altogether supersede that of wheat and barley. Horticulture has been attended in some places with tolerable success. At Rose Hill I have seen gardens which, without the assistance of manure, have continued for a short time to produce well-grown vegetables. But at Sydney, without constantly dressing the ground, it was in vain to expect them, and with it a supply of common vegetables might be procured by diligence in all seasons. Vines of every sort seem to flourish. Melons, cucumbers, and pumpkins run with unbounded luxuriancy, and I am convinced that the grapes of New South Wales will, in a few years, equal those of any other country. That their juice will probably hereafter furnish an indispensable article of luxury at European tables, has already been predicted in the vehemence of speculation. Other fruits are yet in their infancy, but oranges, lemons and figs, of which last indeed I have eaten very good ones, will, I dare believe, in a few years become plentiful. Apples and the fruits of colder climes also promise to gratify expectation. The banana tree has been introduced from Norfolk Island, where it grows spontaneously. Nor will this surprise, if the genial influence of the climate be considered. Placed in a latitude where the beams of the sun in the dreariest season are sufficiently powerful for many hours of the day to dispense warmth and nutrition, the progress of vegetation never is at a stand. The different temperatures of Rose Hill and Sydney in winter, though only 12 miles apart, afford, however, curious matter of speculation. Of a well-attested instance of ice being seen at the latter place I never heard. At the former place its production is common, and once a few flakes of snow fell. The difference can be accounted for only by supposing that the woods stopped the warm vapours of the sea from reaching Rose Hill, which is at the distance of 16 miles inland, whereas Sydney is but 4. Side note: look at the journal which describes the expedition in search of the river, said to exist to the southward of Rose Hill. At the time we felt that extraordinary degree of cold. We were not more than 6 miles southwest of Rose Hill, and about 19 miles from the sea coast. When I mentioned this circumstance to Colonel Gordon at the Cape of Good Hope, he wondered at it, and owned that in his excursions into the interior parts of Africa he had never experienced anything to match it. He attributed its production to large beds of niter, which he said must exist in the neighbourhood. Back to the main text. Again, the heats of summer are more violent at the former place than at the latter, and the variations incomparably quicker. The thermometer has been known to alter at Rose Hill in the course of 9 hours more than 50 degrees Fahrenheit, standing a little before sunrise at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, it's 10 degrees Celsius, and between 1 and 2 at more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 37 degrees Celsius. To convey an idea of the climate in summer, I shall transcribe from my meteorological journal accounts of 2 particular days, which were the hottest we ever suffered under at Sydney. December 27th, 1790. Wind north-northwest. It felt like the blast of a heated oven, and in proportion as it increased, the heat was found to be more intense. The sky hazy, the sun gleaming through at intervals. At 9 a.m, 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 29 degrees Celsius. At noon, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. 12:30, 107.5. From 1 p.m. until 20 minutes past 2, 108.5 degrees Fahrenheit. At 20 minutes past 2, 109 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly 42.8 degrees Celsius. At sunset, 89 degrees Fahrenheit. At 11 p.m, 78.5 degrees Fahrenheit. These measurements, by a large thermometer made by Ramsden and graduated on Fahrenheit scale. December 28th. At 8 a.m, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 30 degrees Celsius. 10 a.m, 93 degrees Fahrenheit. 11 a.m, 101 degrees. At noon, 103.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Half an hour past noon, 104.5 degrees Fahrenheit, which equals roughly 40.3 degrees Celsius. At 1 p.m, 102 degrees Fahrenheit. At 1:15, it stood at only 89 degrees Fahrenheit, having from a sudden shift of wind fallen 13 degrees in 15 minutes. At 5 p.m, 73 degrees Fahrenheit. At sunset, 69.5 degrees Fahrenheit. My observations on this extreme heat, succeeded by so rapid a change, were that of all animals, man seemed to bear it best. Our dogs, pigs and fowls lay panting in the shade, or were rushing into the water. I remarked that a hen belonging to me, which had sat for a fortnight, frequently quitted her eggs, and showed great uneasiness, but never remained from them many minutes at one absence. Taught by instinct, that the wonderful power in the animal body of generating cold in air heated beyond a certain degree was best calculated for the production of her young. The gardens suffered considerably. All the plants which had not taken deep root were withered by the power of the sun. No lasting ill effects, however, arose to the human constitution. A temporary sickness at the stomach, accompanied with lassitude and headache, attacked many, but they were removed generally in 24 hours by an emetic, followed by an anodyne. During the time it lasted, we invariably found that the house was cooler than the open air, and that in proportion as the wind was excluded, was comfort augmented. But even this heat was judged to be far exceeded in the latter end of the following February, when the northwest wind again set in, and blew with great violence for 3 days. At Sydney it fell short by 1 degree of what I have just recorded, but at Rose Hill it was allowed by every person to surpass all that they had before felt, either there or in any other part of the world. Unluckily, they had no thermometer to ascertain its precise height. It must, however, have been intense, from the effects it produced. An immense flight of bats, driven before the wind, covered all the trees around the settlement, whence they every moment dropped dead, or in a dying state, unable longer to endure the burning state of the atmosphere. Nor did the paroquet, though tropical birds, bear it better. The ground was strewed with them in the same condition as the bats. Were I asked the cause of this intolerable heat, I should not hesitate to pronounce that it was occasioned by the wind blowing over immense deserts, which I doubt not exist in a northwest direction from Port Jackson, and not from fires kindled by the natives. This remark I feel necessary, as there were methods used by some persons in the colony, both for estimating the degree of heat and for ascertaining the cause of its production, which I deemed equally unfair and unphilosophical. The thermometer, whence my observations were constantly made, was hung in the open air, in a southern aspect, never reached by the rays of the sun, at the distance of several feet above the ground. My other remarks on the climate will be short. It is changeable beyond any other I ever heard of, but no phenomena sufficiently accurate to reckon upon are found to indicate the approach of alteration. Indeed, for the first 18 months that we lived in the country, changes were supposed to take place, more commonly at the quartering of the moon than at other times. But lunar empire afterwards lost its credit. For the last 2 years and a half of our residing at Port Jackson, its influence was unperceived. 3 days together seldom passed without a necessity occurring for lighting a fire in an evening. A habit d'été, or a habit de demi-saison, would be in the highest degree absurd. Cloud storms and sunshine pass in rapid succession. Of rain we found in general not a sufficiency, but torrents of water sometimes fall. Thunderstorms in summer are common and very tremendous, but they have ceased to alarm, from rarely causing mischief. Sometimes they happen in winter. I have often seen large hailstones fall. Frequent strong breezes from the westward purge the air. These are almost invariably attended with a hard, clear sky. The easterly winds, by setting in from the sea, bring thick weather and rain, except in summer when they become regular sea breezes. The aurora australis is sometimes seen, but is not distinguished by superior brilliancy. To sum up, notwithstanding the inconveniencies which I have enumerated, I will venture to assert in few words that no climate hitherto known is more generally salubrious, or affords more days on which those pleasures which depend on the state of the atmosphere can be enjoyed, than that of New South Wales. The winter season is particularly delightful. Side note. To this cause I ascribe the great number of births which happened, considering the age and other circumstances of many of the mothers. Women who certainly would never have bred in any other climate have produced as fine children as ever were born. Back to the main text. The leading animal production is well known to be the kangaroo. The natural history of this animal will probably be written from observations made upon it in England, as several living ones of both sexes have been brought home. Until such an account shall appear, probably the following desultory observation may prove acceptable. The genus in which the kangaroo is to be classed I leave to better naturalists than myself to determine. How it copulates, those who pretend to have seen disagree in their accounts, nor do we know how long the period of gestation lasts. Prolific it cannot be termed, bringing forth only one at a birth, which the dam carries in her pouch wherever she goes, until the young one be enabled to provide for itself, and even then, in the moment of alarm, she will stop to receive and protect it. We have killed she-kangaroos whose pouches contained young ones, completely covered with fur, and of more than 15 pounds weight, which have ceased to suck, and afterwards were reared by us. In what space of time it reaches such a growth as to be abandoned entirely by the mother, we are ignorant. It is born blind, totally bald, the orifice of the ear closed, and only just the centre of the mouth open. But a black score, denoting what is hereafter to form the dimensions of the mouth, is marked very distinctly on each side of the opening. At its birth, the kangaroo, notwithstanding it weighs when full grown 200 pounds, it's about 100 kg, is not so large as a half-grown mouse. I brought some with me to England, even less, which I took from the pouches of the old ones. This phenomenon is so striking and so contrary to the general laws of nature that an opinion has been started that the animal is brought forth not by the pudenda, but descends from the belly into the pouch, by one of the teats, which are there deposited. On this difficulty, as I can throw no light, I shall hazard no conjecture. It may, however, be necessary to observe that the teats are several inches long, and capable of great dilatation. And here I beg leave to correct an error which crept into my former publication, wherein I asserted that the teats of the kangaroo never exceed 2 in number. They sometimes, though rarely, amount to 4. There is great reason to believe that they are slow of growth and live many years. This animal has a clavicle or collarbone similar to that of the human body. The general colour of the kangaroo is very like that of the ass, donkey, but varieties exist. Its shape and figure are well known by the plates which have been given of it. The elegance of the ear is particularly deserving of admiration. This far exceeds the ear of the hare in quickness of sense, and is so flexible as to admit of being turned by the animal nearly quite round the head, doubtless for the purpose of informing the creature of the approach of its enemies, as it is of a timid nature and poorly furnished with means of defence. Though when compelled to resist, it tears furiously with its forepaws, and strikes forward very hard with its hind legs. Notwithstanding its unfavourable conformation for such a purpose, it swims strongly, but never takes to the water, unless so hard pressed by its pursuers, as to be left without all other refuge. The noise they make is a faint bleat, querulous, but not easy to describe. They are sociable animals, and unite in droves, sometimes to the number of 50 or 60 together, when they are seen playful and feeding on grass, which alone forms their food. At such time they move gently about, like all other quadrupeds, on all fours, but at the slightest noise they spring up on their hind legs and sit erect, listening to what it may proceed from, and if it increases, they bound off on those legs only, the fore ones at the same time being carried close to the breast, like the paws of a monkey, and the tail stretched out, acts as a rudder on a ship. In drinking the kangaroo laps, it is remarkable that they are never found in a fat state, being invariably lean. Of the flesh we always eat with avidity, but in Europe it would not be reckoned a delicacy. A rank flavour forms the principal objection to it. The tail is accounted the most delicious part when stewed. Hitherto I have spoken only of a large or grey kangaroo, to which the natives give the name of patagaran. Side note, kangaroo was a name unknown to them for any animal until we introduced it. When I showed Colby the cows brought out in the Gorgon, he asked me if they were kangaroos. Back to the main text. But there are, besides the kangaroo rat, two other sorts. One of them we called the red kangaroo, from the colour of its fur, which is like that of a hare, and sometimes is mingled with a large portion of black. The natives call it bagaray. It rarely attains to more than 40 pounds weight, 20 kg. The third sort is very rare, and in the formation of its head resembles the opossum. The kangaroo rat is a small animal, never reaching at its utmost growth more than 14 or 15 pounds, 7 kg, and its usual size is not above 7 or 8 pounds. It joins to the head and bristles of a rat, the leading distinctions of a kangaroo by running when pursued on its hind legs only, and the female having a pouch. Unlike the kangaroo, who appears to have no fixed place of residence, this little animal constructs for itself a nest of grass on the ground, of a circular figure about 10 inches in diameter, with a hole on one side, for the creature to enter at, the inside being lined with a finer sort of grass, very soft and downy. But its manner of carrying the materials with which it builds the nest is the greatest curiosity. By entwining its tail, which, like that of all the kangaroo tribe, is long, flexible and muscular, around whatever it wants to remove, and thus dragging along the load behind it. This animal is good to eat, but whether it be more prolific at a birth than the kangaroo, I know not. The Indians sometimes kill the kangaroo, but their greatest destroyer is the wild dog, who feeds on them. Side note, I once found in the woods the greatest part of a kangaroo, just killed by the dogs, which afforded to the three of us a most welcome repast. Marks of its turns and struggles on the ground were very visible. This happened in the evening, and the dogs probably had seen us approach and had run away. At daylight next morning, they saluted us with most dreadful howling for the loss of their prey. Back to the main text. Immediately on hearing or seeing this formidable enemy, the kangaroo flies to the thickest cover, in which, if he can involve himself, he generally escapes. In running to the cover, they always, if possible, keep in paths of their own forming, to avoid the high grass and stumps of trees, which might be sticking up among it, to wound them and impede their course. Our methods of killing them were but two. Either we shot them or hunted them with greyhounds. We were never able to ensnare them. Those sportsmen who relied on the gun seldom met with success, unless they slept near covers into which the kangaroos were wont to retire at night, and watched with great caution and vigilance when the game, in the morning, sallied forth to feed. They were, however, sometimes stolen in upon in the daylight time, and that fascination of the eye, which has been by some authors so much insisted upon, so far acts on the kangaroo, that if he fix his eye upon any one, and no other object move at the same time, he will often continue motionless in stupid gaze, while the sportsman advances, with measured step toward him, until within reach of his gun. The greyhounds, for a long time, were incapable of taking them, but with a brace of dogs, if not near cover, a kangaroo almost always falls, since the greyhounds have acquired by practice the proper method of fastening upon them. Nevertheless, the dogs are often miserably torn by them. The rough, wiry greyhound suffers least in the conflict, and is most prized by the hunters. Other quadrupeds, besides the wild dog, consist only of the flying squirrel, of 3 kinds of opossums, and some minute animals, usually marked by the distinction which so peculiarly characterizes the opossum's tribe. The rats, soon after our landing, became not only numerous but formidable, from the destruction they occasioned in the stores. Latterly they had almost disappeared, though to account for their absence were not easy. The first time Colby saw a monkey, he called "Woorah," a rat, but on examining its paws, he exclaimed with astonishment and affright, "Moolah," a man. At the head of the birds, the cassowary, or emu, stands conspicuous. The print of it, which has already been given to the public, is so accurate for the most part that it would be malignant criticism in a work of this kind to point out a few trifling defects. Here again, naturalists must look forward to that information, which longer and more intimate knowledge of the feathered tribe than I can supply shall appear. I have nevertheless had the good fortune to see what was never seen but once in the country I am describing by Europeans, a hatch or flock of young cassowaries with the old bird. I counted 10, but others said there were 12. We came suddenly upon them, and they ran up a hill, exactly like a flock of turkeys, but so fast that we could not get a shot at them. The largest cassowary ever killed in the settlement weighed 94 pounds. 3 young ones, which had been by accident separated from the dam, were once taken and presented to the governor. They were not larger than so many pullets, although at first sight they appeared to be so, from the length of their necks and legs. They were very beautifully striped, and from their tender state were judged to be not more than 3 or 4 days old. They lived only a few days. A single egg, the production of a cassowary, was picked up in a desert place, dropped on the sand without covering or protection of any kind. Its form was nearly a perfect ellipsis, and the colour of the shell a dark green, full of little indents on its surface. It measured 11 inches and a half in circumference, 5 inches and a quarter in height, and weighed 1.25 pounds. Afterwards, we had the good fortune to take a nest. It was found by a soldier, in a sequestered solitary situation, made in a patch of lofty fern, about 3 feet in diameter, rather of an oblong shape, and composed of dry leaves and tops of fern stalks, very artificially put together. The hollow in which lay the eggs, 12 in number, seemed made solely by the pressure of the bird. The eggs were regularly placed in the following position. So a picture of a delta shape consisting of 5, and then parallel behind that another 5, and then 2 others that are behind the 2 deltas. So it kind of looks like an arrow. The soldier, instead of greedily plundering his prize, communicated the discovery to an officer, who immediately set out for the spot. When they had arrived there, they continued for a long time to search in vain for their object, and the soldier was just about to be stigmatized with ignorance, credulity, or imposture, when suddenly up started the old bird, and the treasure was found at their feet. The food of the cassowary is either grass or a yellow bellflower growing in the swamps. It deserves remark that the natives deny the cassowary to be a bird, because it does not fly. Of other birds, the varieties are very numerous. Of the parrot tribe alone, I could, while I am writing, count up from memory 14 different sorts. Hawks are very numerous, so are quails. A single snipe has been shot. Ducks, geese, and other aquatic birds are often seen in large flocks, but are universally so shy that it is found difficult to shoot them. Some of the smaller birds are very beautiful, but they are not remarkable for either sweetness or variety of notes. To one of them, not bigger than a tommet, we have given the name of coach whip, from its note exactly resembling the smack of a whip. The country, I am of opinion, would abound with birds, did not the natives be perpetually setting fire to the grass and bushes, destroy the greater part of the nests, a cause which also contributes to render small quadrupeds scarce. They are besides ravenously fond of eggs, and eat them whenever they find them. They call the roe of a fish and a bird's egg by one name. So much has been said of the abundance in which fish are found in the harbours of New South Wales, that it looks like detraction to oppose a contradiction. Some share of knowledge may, however, be supposed to belong to experience. Many a night have I toiled, in the times of distress, on the public service, from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 8 o'clock the next morning, hauling the seine in every part of the harbour of Port Jackson. And after a circuit of many miles, and between 20 and 30 hauls, seldom more than 100 pounds of fish were taken. However, it sometimes happens that a glut enters the harbour, and for a few days they sufficiently abound. But the universal voice of all professed fishermen is, that they never fished in a country where success was so precarious and uncertain. I shall not pretend to enumerate the variety of fish which are found. They are seen from a whale to a gudgeon. In the intermediate classes may be reckoned sharks of a monstrous size, skite, rock cod, grey mullet, bream, horse mackerel, now and then a sole and John Dory, and innumerable others unknown in Europe, many of which are extremely delicious, and many highly beautiful. At the top of the list, as an article of food, stands a fish which we named light horseman. The relish of this excellent fish was increased by our natives, who pointed out to us its delicacies. No epicure in England could pick a head with more glee and dexterity than they do that of a light horseman. Reptiles in the swamps and covers are numerous. Of snakes there are 2 or 3 sorts, but whether the bite of any of them be mortal or even venomous is somewhat doubtful. I know but of one well-attested instance of a bite being received from a snake. A soldier was bitten so as to draw blood, and the wound healed as a simple incision usually does, without showing any symptom of malignity. A dog was reported to be bitten by a snake, and the animal swelled and died in great agony, but I will by no means affirm that the cause of his death was fairly ascertained. It is, however, certain that the natives show on all occasions the utmost horror of the snake, and will not eat it, although they esteem lizards, iguanas, and many other reptiles delicious fare. On this occasion they always observe that if the snake bites them, they become lame. But whether by this they mean temporary or lasting lameness, I do not pretend to determine. I have often eaten snakes, and always found them palatable and nutritive, though it was difficult to stew them to a tender state. Summer here, as in all other countries, brings with it a long list of insects. In the neighbourhood of rivers and morasses, mosquitoes and sandflies are never wanting at any season, but at Sydney they are seldom numerous or troublesome. The most nauseous and destructive of all the insects is a fly, which blows not eggs but large living maggots, and if the body of the fly be opened, it is found full of them. Of ants there are several sorts, one of which bites very severely. The white ant is sometimes seen. Spiders are large and numerous. Their webs are not only the strongest, but the finest and most silky I ever felt. I have often thought their labour might be turned to advantage. It has, I believe, been proven that spiders, were it not for their quarrelsome disposition, which irritates them to attack and destroy each other, might be employed more profitably than silkworms. The hardiness of some of the insects deserves to be mentioned. A beetle was immersed in proof spirits for 4 hours, and when taken out, crawled away almost immediately. It was a second time immersed, and continued in a glass of rum for a day and a night, at the expiration of which period it still showed symptoms of life. Perhaps, however, what I from ignorance deem wonderful is common. The last but most important production yet remains to be considered. Whether plodding in London, reeking with human blood in Paris, or wandering amidst the solitary wilds of New South Wales, man is ever an object of interest, curiosity, and reflection. The natives around Port Jackson are in person rather more diminutive and slightly made, especially about the thighs and legs, than the Europeans. It is doubtful whether their society contained a person of 6 feet high. The tallest I ever measured reached 5 feet 11 inches, and men of his height were rarely seen. Benny Lon, who towered above the majority of his countrymen, stood barely 5 feet 8 inches high. His other principal dimensions were as follows. Girth of chest, 2 feet 10 inches. Girth of the belly, 2 feet 6.5 inches. Girth of the thigh, 18.5 inches. Girth of the leg at the calf, 12 3/8 inches. Girth of the leg at the small, 10 inches. Girth of the arm halfway between the shoulder and the elbow, 9 inches. Instances of natural deformity are scarce, nor did we ever see one of them left-handed. They are indeed nearly ambidexter, but the sword, the spear, and the fish gig are always used with the right hand. Their muscular force is not great, but with planiency of their limbs renders them very active. Give to civilized man all his machines, and he is superior to the savage. But without these, how inferior is he found on opposition, even more so than the savage in the first instance. These are the words of Rousseau, and like many more of his positions, must be received with limitation. Were an unarmed Englishman or an unarmed New Zealand Hollander to engage, the latter I think would fall. Mr. Cook seems inclined to believe the covering of their heads to be wool, but this is erroneous. It is certainly hair, which when regularly combed becomes soon nearly as flexible and docile as our own. Their teeth are not so white and good as those generally found in Indian nations, except in the children, but the inferiority originates in themselves. They bite sticks, stones, shells, and all other hard substances indiscriminately with them, which quickly destroys the enamel and gives them a jagged and uneven appearance. A high forehead with prominent overhanging eyebrows is their leading characteristic, and when it does not operate to destroy all openness of countenance, gives an air of resolute dignity to the aspect, which recommends, in spite of a true Negro nose, thick lips, and a wide mouth. The prominent shin bone, so invariably found in the Africans, is not, however, seen. But in another particular, they are more alike. The rank offensive smell, which disgusts so much in the Negro, prevails strongly among them when they are in their native state, but it wears off in those who have resided with us and have been taught habits of cleanliness. Their hands and feet are small, especially the former. Side note, I mention this, among other circumstances, to Colonel Gorgon when I was at the Cape, and he told me that it indicated poverty and inadequacy of living. He instanced to me the Hottentots in Caffres. The former fare poorly and have small hands and feet. The Kaffirs, their neighbours, live plenteously and have very large ones. This remark cannot be applied to civilized nations, where so many facetious causes operate. Back to the main text. Their eyes are full, black, and piercing, but the almost perpetual strain in which the optic nerve is kept by looking out for prey renders their sight weak. At an early age, then, we in general find ours affected. These large black eyes are universally shaded by the long, thick, sweeping eyelash, so much prized in appreciating beauty that perhaps hardly any face is so homely, which this aid cannot, in some degree, render interesting, and hardly any so lovely, which, without it, bears not some trace of insipidity. Their tone of voice is loud, but not harsh. I have in some of them found it very pleasing. Longevity, I think, is seldom attained by them. Unceasing agitation wears out the animal frame, and is unfriendly to length of days. We have seen them grey with age, but not old, perhaps never beyond 60 years. But it may be said the American Indian, in his undebauched state, lives to an advanced period. True, but he has his seasons of repose. He reaps his little harvest of maize, and continues in idleness while it lasts. He kills the roebuck or the moose deer, which maintains him and his family for many days, during which cessation of muscles regain their spring, and fit him for fresh toils. whereas every sun awakes the native of New South Wales, unless a whale be thrown upon the coast, to a renewal of labour, to provide subsistence for the present day. The women are proportionally smaller than the men. I never measured but 2 of them, who were both, I think, about the medium height. One of them, a sister of Bannylong, stood exactly 5 feet 2 inches high. The other, named Guridiana, was shorter by 1/4 of an inch. But I cannot break from Guridiana so abruptly. She belonged to the tribe of Camaragal, and rarely came among us. One day, however, she entered my house to complain of hunger. She excelled in beauty all their females I ever saw, her age about 18. The firmness and symmetry and the luxuriancy of her bosom might have tempted painting to copy its charms. Her mouth was small, and her teeth, though exposed to all the destructive purposes to which they apply them, were white, sound, and unbroken. Her countenance, though marked by some of the characteristics of her native land, was distinguished by a softness and sensibility unequalled in the rest of her countrywomen, and I was willing to believe that these traits indicated the disposition of her mind. I had never before seen this elegant, timid female, of whom I had often heard, but the interest I took in her led me to question her about her husband and family. She answered me by repeating a name, which I have now forgotten, and told me she had no children. I was seized with a strong propensity to learn whether the attractions of Guridiana were sufficiently powerful to secure her from the brutal violence with which the women are treated. And as I found my question either ill understood or reluctantly answered, I proceeded to examine her head, the part on which the husband's vengeance generally alights. With grief I found it covered by contusions and mangled by scars. The poor creature, grown by this time more confident from perceiving that I pitied her, pointed out a wound just above her left knee, which she told me was received from a spear thrown at her by a man, who had lately dragged her by force from her home to gratify his lust. I afterwards observed that this wound had caused a slight lameness, and that she limped in walking. I could only compassionate her wrongs and sympathize in her misfortunes to elevate her present sense of them. When she took her leave, I gave her, however, all the bread and salt pork which my little stock afforded. After this, I never saw her but once, when I happened to be near the harbour's mouth in a boat with Captain Ball. We met her in a canoe, with several more of her sex. She was painted for a ball, with broad stripes of white earth from head to foot, so that she no longer looked like the same Guridiana. We offered her several presents, all of which she readily accepted, but finding our eagerness and solicitude to inspect her, she managed her canoe with such address as to elude our too near approach, and acted the coquette to admiration. To return from this digression to my subject, I have only further to observe that the estimation of female beauty among the natives, the men at least, is in this country the same as in most others. Were the New Hollander to portray his mistress, he would draw her the Venus or belle fesse. Whenever Bannylong described Bed to us, his favourite fair, he always painted her in this and another particular as eminently luxuriant. Unsatisfied, however, with natural beauty, like the people of all other countries, they strive by adscititious embellishments to heighten attraction, and often with as little success. Hence the naked savage of New South Wales pierces the septum of his nose, through which he runs a stick or a bone, and sacrifices his body, the charms of which increase in proportion to the number and magnitude of seams by which it is distinguished. The operation is performed by making 2 longitudinal incisions with a sharpened shell, and afterwards pinching up with the nails the intermediate space of skin and flesh, which thereby becomes considerably elevated, and forms a prominence as thick as a man's finger. No doubt but pain must be severely felt until the wound be healed. But the love of ornament defies weaker considerations. and no English bow can bear more stoutly the extraction of his teeth to make room for a fresh set from a chimney sweeper, or a fair one suffer her tender ears to be perforated with more heroism than the grisly nymphs on the banks of Port Jackson submit their sable shoulders to the remorseless lancet. That these scarifications are intended solely to increase personal allurement, I will not, however, positively affirm. Similar, perhaps, to the cause of an excision of part of the little finger of the left hand in the women and of the front tooth in the man. Side note. It is to be observed that neither of these ceremonies is universal, but nearly so. Why there should exist exemptions I cannot resolve. The manner of executing them is as follows. The finger is taken off by means of a ligature, generally a sinew of a kangaroo, tied so tight as to stop the circulation of the blood, which induces mortification, and the part drops off. I remember to have seen Colby's child, when about a month old, on whom this operation had been just performed by her mother. The little wretch seemed in pain, and her hand was greatly swelled. But this was deemed too trifling a consideration to deserve regard in a case of so much importance. The tooth intended to be taken out is loosened by the gum being scarified on both sides with a sharp shell. The end of a stick is then applied to the tooth, which is struck gently several times with a stone until it becomes easily movable. When the coup de grace is given by a smart stroke, notwithstanding these precautions, I have seen a considerable degree of swelling and inflammation follow the extraction. Imi Rawinyi, I remember, suffered severely, but he boasted the firmness and hardihood with which he had endured it. It is seldom performed on those who are under 16 years old. And back to the main text. Or probably, after all our conjectures, superstitious ceremonies, by which they hope either to avert evil or to propagate good, are intended. The colours on which they besmear the bodies of both sexes possibly date from the same common origin. White paint is strictly appropriate to the dance. Red seems to be used on numberless occasions, and is considered as a colour of less consequence. It may be remarked that they translate the epithet white, when they speak of us, not by the name which they assign to this white earth, but by that which they distinguish the palms of their hands. As this leads to an important subject, I shall at once discuss it. Have these people any religion, any knowledge of or believe in a deity, any connection of the immortality of the soul, are questions which have been oft put to me since my arrival in England. I shall endeavour to answer them with candour and seriousness. Until belief be enlightened by revelation and chastened by reason, religion and superstition are terms of equal import. One of our earliest impressions is the consciousness of a superior power. The various forms under which this impression has manifested itself are objects of the most curious speculation. The native of New South Wales believes that particular aspects and appearances of the heavenly bodies predict good or evil consequences to himself and his friends. He oftentimes calls the sun and moon weary, that is, malignant pernicious. Should he see the leading fixed stars, many of which he can call by name, obscured by vapours, he sometimes disregards the omen, and sometimes draws from it the most dreary conclusions. I remember Abaru running into a room where a company was assembled, and uttering frightful exclamations of impending mischiefs about to light on her and her countrymen. When questioned on the cause of such agitation, she went to the door and pointed to the skies, saying that whenever the stars wore that appearance, misfortunes to the natives always followed. The night was cloudy, and the air disturbed by meteors. I have heard many more of them testify similar apprehensions. However involved in darkness, and disfigured by error, such a belief be, no one will, I presume, deny that it conveys a direct implication of superior agency, of a power independent of, and uncontrolled by those who are the objects of its vengeance. But proof stops not here. When they hear the thunder roll and view the livid glare, they flee them not, but rush out and deprecate destruction. They have a dance and a song appropriated to this awful occasion, which consists of the wildest and most uncouth noises and gestures. Would they act such a ceremony, did they not conceive that either the thunder itself, or he who directs the thunder, might be appropriated by its performance? That a living intellectual principle exists, capable of comprehending the petition, and of either granting or denying it. They never address prayers to bodies which they know to be inanimate, either to implore their protection or avert their wrath. When the gum tree in a tempest nods over them, or a rock overhanging the cavern in which they sleep threatens by its fall to crush them, they calculate, as far as their knowledge extends, on physical principles, like other men, the nearness and magnitude of the danger, and flee it accordingly. And yet there is reason to believe that from accidents of this nature they suffer more than from lightning. Banilun once showed us a cave, the top of which had fallen in, and buried under its ruins 7 people, who were sleeping under it. To descend. Is not even the ridiculous superstition of Colby related in one of our journeys to the Hawkesbury? And again the following instance. Abaru was sick. To cure her, one of her own sex slightly cut her on the forehead in a perpendicular direction with an oyster shell, so as just to fetch blood. She then put one end of a string to the wound, and, beginning to sing, held the other end to her own gums, which she rubbed until they bled copiously. This blood, she contended, was the blood of the patient flowing through the string, and that she would thereby soon recover. Abaru became well, and firmly believed that she owed her cure to the treatment she had received. Are not these, I say, links, subordinate ones indeed, of the same golden chain? He who believes in magic confesses supernatural agency, and a belief of this sort extends further in many persons than they are willing to allow. They have lived men so inconsistent with their own principles as to deny the existence of God, who have nevertheless turned pale at the tricks of a mountebank, but not to multiply arguments on a subject where demonstration, at least to me, is incontestable. I shall close by expressing my firm belief that the Indians of New South Wales acknowledge the existence of a superintending deity, of their ideas of the origin and duration of his existence, of his power and capacity, of his benignity or maleficence, or of their own emanation from him, I pretend not to speak. I have often, in common with others, tried to gain information from them on this head, but we were always repulsed by obstacles, which we could neither pass by or surmount. Mr. Dawes attempted to teach Abaru some of our notions of religion, and hoped that she would thereby be induced to communicate hers in return. But her levity and love of play in a great measure defeated his efforts, although everything he did learn from her served to confirm what is here advanced. It may be remarked that when they attended at church with us, which was a common practice, they always preserved profound silence and decency, as if conscious that some religious ceremony on our side was performing. The question of whether they believe in the immortality of the soul will take up very little time to answer. They are universally fearful of spirits. Side note: it is remarkable, says Cicero, that there is no nation, whether barbarous or civilized, that does not believe in the existence of spirits. Back to the main text. They call the spirit morn. They have often scrupled to approach a corpse, saying that the morn will seize them, and that it fastens upon them in the night when asleep. Side note: as they often eat to satiety, even to produce sickness, may not this be the effect of an overloaded stomach, the nightmare? Back to the main text. When asked where their deceased friends are, they always point to the skies. To believe in after existence is to confess the immortality of some part of being. To inquire whether they assign a limited period to such future state would be superfluous. This is one of the subtleties of speculation, which a savage may be supposed not to have considered, without impeachment either of his sagacity or happiness. The manner of interring the dead has been amply described. It is certain that instead of burying, they sometimes burn the corpse. But the cause of distinction we know not. A dead body, covered by a canoe, at whose side a sword and shield were placed in state, was once discovered. All that we could learn about this important personage was that he was a Guiagal, one of the tribe of Guia, and a celebrated warrior. To appreciate their general powers of mind is difficult. Ignorance, prejudice, the force of habit continually interfere to prevent dispassionate judgment. I have heard men so unreasonably as to exclaim at the stupidity of these people for not comprehending what a small share of reflection would have taught them they ought not to have expected. And others again I have heard so sanguine in their admiration as to extol for proofs of elevated genius what the commonest abilities were capable of executing. If they be considered as a nation, whose general advancement and acquisitions are to be weighed, they certainly rank very low, even in the scale of savages. They may perhaps dispute the right of precedency with the Hottentots, or the shivering tribes who inhabit the shores of Magellan. But how inferior do they show when compared with the subtle African, the patient, watchful American, or the elegant, timid islander of the South Seas? Though suffering from the vicissitudes of their climate, strangers to clothing, though feeling the sharpness of hunger, and knowing the precariousness of supply from that element on whose stores they principally depend, ignorant of cultivating the earth, a less enlightened state, we shall exclaim, can hardly exist. But if from general view we descend to particular inspection and examine individually the persons who compose this community, they will certainly rise in estimation. In the narrative part of this work, I have endeavoured rather to detail information than to deduce conclusions, leaving to the reader the exercise of his own judgment. The behaviour of Arabinu, of Banilon, of Colby, and many others, is copiously described, and assuredly he who shall make just allowance for uninstructed nature will hardly accuse any of those persons of stupidity or deficiency of apprehension. To offer my own opinion on the subject, I do not hesitate to declare that the natives of New South Wales possess a considerable portion of that acumen, or sharpness of intellect, which bespeaks genius. All savages hate toil, and place happiness in inaction, and neither the arts of civilized life can be practiced, or the advantages of it felt, without application and labour. Hence they resist knowledge, and the adoption of manners and customs differing from their own. The progress of reason is not only slow, but mechanical. I don't know French, but I'll give it a bash. De toutes les instructions propres à l'homme, celle qui acquitte le plus tard et le plus difficilement est la raison même. The tranquil indifference and uninquiring eye with which they surveyed our works of art have often, in my hearing, been stigmatized as proofs of stupidity and want of reflection. But surely we should discriminate between ignorance and defect of understanding. The truth was, they often neither comprehended the design nor conceived the utility of such works. But on subjects in any degree familiarized to their ideas, they generally testified not only acuteness of discernment, but a large portion of good sense. I have always thought that the distinctions they showed in their estimate of us on first entering into our society strongly displayed the latter quality. When they were led into our respective houses, at once to be astonished and awed by our superiority, their attention was directly turned to objects with which they were acquainted. They passed without rapture or emotion our numerous artifices and contrivances. But when they saw a collection of weapons of war, or of the skins of animals and birds, they never failed to exclaim and to confer with each other on the subject. The master of that house became the object of their regard, as they concluded he must be either a renowned warrior or an expert hunter. Our surgeons grew into their esteem from a like cause. In a very early stage of intercourse, several natives were present at the amputation of a leg. When they first penetrated the intention of the operator, they were confounded, not believing it possible that such an operation could be performed without loss of life, and they called aloud to him to desist. But when they saw the torrent of blood stopped, the vessels taken up, and the stump dressed, their horror and alarm yielded to astonishment and admiration, which they expressed by the loudest tokens. If these instances bespeak not nature and good sense, I have yet to learn the meaning of these terms. If it be asked why the same intelligent spirit which led them to contemplate and applaud the success of the sportsman and the skill of the surgeon did not equally excite them to meditate on the labours of the builder and the ploughman, I can only answer that what we see in its remote cause is always more feebly felt than that which presents to our immediate grasp, both in origin and effect. Their leading good and bad qualities I shall concisely touch upon. Of their intrepidity no doubt can exist. Their levity, their fickleness, their passionate extravagance of character cannot be defended. They are indeed sudden and quick in quarrel, but if their resentment be easily roused, their thirst of revenge is not implacable. Their honesty, when tempted by novelty, is not unimpeachable, but in their own society there is good reason to believe that few breaches of it occur. It were well if similar praise could be given to their veracity, but truth they neither prize nor practice. When they wish to deceive, they scruple not to utter the grossest and most hardened lies. Side note: this may serve to account for the contradictions of many of their accounts to us. Back to the main text. Their attachment and gratitude to those among us whom they have professed to love have always remained inviolable, unless effaced by resentment from sudden provocation. Then, like all other Indians, the impulse of the moment is alone regarded by them. Some of their manufacture displays ingenuity when the rude tools with which they work and their celerity of execution are considered. The canoes, fish gigs, swords, shields, spears, throwing sticks, clubs and hatchets are made by the man. To the woman are committed the fishing lines, hooks and nets. As very ample collections of all these articles are to be found in many museums in England, I shall only briefly describe the way in which the most remarkable of them are made. The fish gigs and spears are commonly, but not universally, made of a long spiral shoot, which arises from the top of the yellow gum tree, and bears the flower. The former have several prongs, barbed with the bone of kangaroo. The latter are sometimes barbed with the same substance, or with the prickle of a stingray, or with stone, or hardened gum, and sometimes simply pointed. Dexterity in throwing and parrying the spear is considered as the highest acquirement. The children of both sexes practice from the time that they are able to throw a rush. Their first essay, it forms their constant recreation. They afterwards heave at each other with pointed twigs. He who acts on the defensive holds a piece of new soft bark in the left hand to represent a shield, in which he receives the darts of the assailant, the points sticking in it. Now commences his turn. He extracts the twigs and darts them back at the first thrower, who catches them similarly. In warding off the spear, they never present their front, but always turn their side, their head at the same time just clear of the shield, to watch the flight of the weapon and the body covered. If a spear drop from them when thus engaged, they do not stoop to pick it up, but hook it between the toes, and so lift it until it meet the hand. Thus the eye is never diverted from its object, the foe. If they wish to break a spear or any wooden substance, they lay it not across the thigh or the body, but upon the head, and press down the ends until it snap. Their shields are of two sorts, that are called elimon, is nothing but a piece of bark with a handle fixed in the inside of it. The other, dug out of solid wood, is called aragoon, and is made as follows, with great labour. On the bark of a tree they mark the size of the shield, then dig the outline as deep as possible in the wood with hatchets, and lastly flake it off as thick as they can by driving in wedges. The sword is a large heavy piece of wood, shaped like a sabre and capable of inflicting a mortal wound. In using it they do not strike with the convex side, but with the concave one, and strive to hook in their antagonists so as to have them under their blows. The fishing lines are made of the bark of a shrub. The woman rolls shreds of this on the inside of the thigh so as to twist it together, carefully inserting the ends of every fresh piece into the last made. They are not as strong as the lines of equal size, formed of hemp. The fish hooks are chopped with the stone out of a particular shell, and afterwards rubbed until they become smooth. They are very much curved and not barbed. Considering the quickness with which they are finished, the excellence of the work it is to be inspected is admirable. In all these manufactures, the sole of the foot is used, both by men and women, as a workboard. They chop a piece of wood or aught else upon it, even with an iron tool, without hurting themselves. It is indeed nearly as hard as the hoof of an ox. Their method of procuring fire is this. They take a reed and shave one side of the surface flat. In this they make a small incision to reach the pith, and introducing a stick purposely blunted at the end into it, turn it round between the hands, as chocolate is milled, as swiftly as possible until flame is produced. As this operation is not only laborious, but the effect tedious, they frequently relieve each other at the exercise, and to avoid being often reduced to the necessity of putting it in practice, they always, if possible, carry a lighted stick with them, whether in their canoes or moving from place to place on land. Their treatment of wounds must not be omitted. A doctor is with them, a person of importance and esteem, but his province seems rather to charm away occult diseases than to act the surgeon's part, which, as a subordinate science, is exercised indiscriminately. Their excellent habit of body, side note, their native hardiness of constitution is great. I saw a woman, on the day she was brought to bed, carry her newborn infant from Botany Bay to Port Jackson, a distance of 6 miles, and afterwards light a fire and dress fish. Back to the main text. The effect of drinking water only speedily heals wounds without an exterior application, which with us would take weeks or months to close. They are nevertheless sadly tormented by a cutaneous eruption, but we never found it contagious. After receiving a contusion, if the parts swell, they fasten a ligature very tightly above it, so as to stop all circulation. Whether to this application or to their undebauched habit it to be attributable, I know not, but it is certain that a disabled limb among them is rarely seen, although violent inflammations from bruises, which in us would bring on a gangrene, daily happen. If they get burned, either from rolling into the fire when asleep, or from the flame catching the grass on which they lie, both of which are common accidents, they cover the part with a thin paste of kneaded clay, which excludes the air and adheres to the wound until it be cured and the eschar falls off. Their form of government and the detail of domestic life yet remain untold. The former cannot occupy much space, without distinctions of rank, except those which youth and vigour confer. Theirs is strictly a system of equality, attended with only one inconvenience, the strong triumph over the weak. Whether any law exist among them for the punishment of offences committed against society, or whether the injured party in all cases seeks for relief in private revenge, I will not positively affirm, though I am strongly inclined to believe that only the latter method prevails. I have already said that they are divided into tribes, but what constitutes the right of being enrolled in a tribe, or where exclusion begins and ends, I am ignorant. The tribe of Camaragal is of all the most numerous and powerful. The superiority probably arose from possessing the best fishing ground, and perhaps from their having suffered less from the ravages of the smallpox. In the domestic detail there may be novelty, but variety is unattainable. One day must be very like another in the life of a savage. Summoned by the calls of hunger and the returning light, he starts from his beloved indolence, and snatching up the remaining brand of his fire, hastens with his wife to the strand to commence their daily task. In general, the canoe is assigned to her, into which she puts the fire and pushes off into deep water, to fish with hook and line, this being the province of the woman. If she have a child at the breast, she takes it with her, and thus in her skiff, a piece of bark tied at both ends with vines, and the edge of it but just above the surface of the water, she pushes out regardless of the elements, if they be but commonly agitated, while she paddles to the fishing bank. And while employed there, the child is placed on her shoulders, entwining its little legs around her neck, and closely grasping her hair with its hands. To its first cries she remains insensible, as she believes them to arise only from the inconveniency of a situation, to which she knows it must be inured. But if its plaints continue, and she supposes it to be in want of food, she ceases her fishing, and clasps it to her breast. A European spectator is struck with horror and astonishment at the perilous situation, but accidents seldom happen. The management of the canoe alone appears a work of unsurmountable difficulty. Its breadth is so inadequate to its length. The Indians, aware of its ticklish formation, practice from infancy to move in it without risk. Use only could reconcile them to the painful position in which they sit in it. They drop in the middle of the canoe upon their knees, and resting the buttocks on the heels, extend the knees to the sides, against which they press strongly, so as to form a poise, sufficient to retain the body in its situation, and relieve the weight which would otherwise fall wholly upon the toes. Either in this position, or cautiously moving in the centre of the vessel, the mother tends her child, keeps up her fire, which is laid on a small patch of earth, paddles her boat, broils fish, and provides in part the subsistence of the day. Their favourite bait for fish is a cockle. The husband, in the meantime, warily moves to some rock, over which he can peep into unruffled water to look for fish. For this purpose he always chooses a weather shore, and the various windings of the numerous creeks and indents always afford one. Silent and watchful, he chews a cockle and spits it into the water. Allured by the bait, the fish appear from beneath the rock. He prepares his fish gig, and pointing it down, moves it gently towards the object, always trying to approach it as near as possible to the fish before the stroke be given. At last he deems himself sufficiently advanced, and plunges it at his prey. If he has hit his mark, he continues his efforts and endeavours to transpierce it, or so to entangle the barbs in the flesh as to prevent its escape. When he finds it secure, he drops the instrument, and the fish, fastened on the prongs, rises to the surface, floated by the buoyancy of the staff. Nothing now remains to be done but to haul it to him, with either a long stick or another fish gig, for an Indian, if he can help it, never goes into the water on these occasions, to disengage it and to look out for fresh sport. But sometimes the fish have either deserted the rocks for deeper water, or are too shy to suffer approach. He then launches his canoe, and leaving the shore behind, watches the rise of the prey out of the water, and darts his gig at them to the distance of many yards. Large fish he seldom procures by this method, but among shoals of mullets, which are either pursued by enemies or leap at objects on the surface, he is often successful. Benny Long has been seen to kill more than 20 fish by this method in an afternoon. The women sometimes use the gig, and always carry one in each canoe, to strike large fish which may be hooked, and thereby facilitate the capture. But generally speaking, this instrument is appropriate to the men, who are never seen fishing with the line, and would indeed consider it a degradation of their preeminence. When prevented by tempestuous weather, or any other cause from fishing, these people suffer severely. They have no resource but to pick up shellfish which may happen to cling to the rocks and be cast on the beach, to hunt particular reptiles and small animals which are scarce, to dig fern root in the swamps, or to gather a few berries, destitute of flavour and nutrition, which the woods afford. To elevate the sensation of hunger, they tie a ligature tightly around the belly, as I have often seen our soldiers do from the same cause. Let us, however, suppose them successful in procuring fish. The wife returns to land with her booty, and the husband, quitting the rock, joins his stock to hers, and they repair either to some neighbouring cavern or to their hut. This last is composed of pieces of bark, very rudely piled together, in shape as like a soldier's tent, as any known image to which I can compare it, too low to admit the lord of it to stand upright, but long and wide enough to admit 3 or 4 persons to lie under it. Here shelters himself, a being born with all those powers which education expands, and all those sensations which culture refines. With a lighted stick brought from the canoe, they now kindle a small fire at the mouth of the hut and prepare to dress their meal. They begin by throwing the fish, exactly in the state in which it came from the water, on the fire. When it has become a little warmed, they take it off, rub away the scales, and then peel off with their teeth the surface, which they find done and eat. Now and not before they gut it, but if the fish be a mullet, or any other which has a fatty substance about the intestines, they carefully guard that part, and esteem it a delicacy. The cooking is now completed, by the remaining part being laid on the fire until it be sufficiently done. A bird, a lizard, a rat, or any other animal they treat in the same manner. The feathers of the one and the fur of the other they thus get rid of. Side note: they broil indiscriminately all substances which they eat, though they boil water in small quantities. In oyster shells for particular purposes, they never conceived it possible, until shown by us, to dress meat by this method, having no vessel capable of containing a fish or a bird which would stand fire. 2 of them once stole 12 pounds of rice and carried it off. They knew how we cooked it, and by way of putting it in practice, they spread the rice on the ground before a fire, and as it grew hot, continued to throw water on it. Their ingenuity was, however, very ill reward, for the rice became so mingled with the dirt and sand on which it was laid, that they could not eat it, and the whole was spoiled. Back to the main text. Unless summoned away by irresistible necessity, sleep always follows the repast. They would gladly prolong it until the following day, but the canoe wants repair, the fish gig must be barbed afresh, new lines must be twisted, and new hooks chopped out. They depart to their respective tasks, which end only with the light. Such is the general life of an Indian, but even he has his hours of relaxation. In seasons of success, when fish abounds, wanton with a plenty, he now meditates an attack upon the chastity of some neighbouring fair one, and watching his opportunity, he seizes her and drags her away to complete his purpose. The signal of war is lighted. Her lover, her father, her brothers, her tribe assemble and vow revenge on the spoiler. He tells his story to his tribe. They judge the case to be a common one, and agree to support him. Battle ensues. They discharge their spears at each other, and legs and arms are transpierced. When the spears are expended, the combatants close, and every species of violence is practised. They seize their antagonist, and snap like enraged dogs. They wield the sword and club. The bone shatters beneath their fall, and they drop the prey of unsparing vengeance. Too justly, as my observations teach me, has Hobbes defined a state of nature to be a state of war. In the method of waging it among these people, one thing should not, however, escape notice. Unlike all other Indians, they never carry on operations in the night, or seek to destroy by ambush and surprise. Their ardent, fearless character seeks fair and open combat only. But enmity has its moments of pause, then they assemble to sing and dance. We always found their songs disagreeable, from their monotony. They are numerous, and vary both in measure and time. They have songs of war, of hunting, of fishing, for the rise and set of the sun, for rain, for thunder, and for many other occasions. One of these songs, which may be termed a speaking pantomime, recites the courtship between the sexes, and is accompanied with acting. Highly expressive, I once heard and saw Nangbari and Abaru perform it. After a few preparatory motions, she gently sunk on the ground, as if in a fainting fit. Nangbari, applying his mouth to her ear, began to whisper in it, and burying her bosom, breathed on it several times. At length, the period of the swoon having expired, with returning animation, she gradually raised herself. She now began to relate what she had seen in her vision, mentioning several of her countrymen by name, whom we knew to be dead, mixed with other strange, incoherent matter, equally new and inexplicable, though all tending to one leading point, the sacrifice of her charms to her lover. At their dances I have often been present, but I confess myself unable to convey in description an accurate account of them. Like their songs, they are conceived to represent the progress of the passions and the occupations of life. Full of seeming confusion, yet regular and systematic, their wild gesticulations and frantic distortions of body are calculated rather to terrify than delight a spectator. These dances consist of short parts or acts, accompanied with frequent vociferations, and a kind of hissing or whizzing noise. They commonly end with a loud rapid shout, and after a short respite are renewed. While the dance lasts, one of them, usually a person of note and estimation, beats time with a stick on a wooden instrument held in the left hand, accompanying the music with his voice, and the dancers sometimes sing in concert. I have already mentioned that white is the colour appropriated to the dance, but the style of painting is left to every one's fancy. Some are streaked with waving lines from head to foot, others marked by broad cross bars on the breast, back and thighs, or encircled with spiral lines, or regularly striped like a zebra. Of these ornaments, the face never wants its share, and it is hard to conceive anything in the shape of humanity more hideous and terrific than they appear to a stranger, seen perhaps through the livid gleam of the fire, the eyes surrounded by large white circles in contrast with the black ground, the hair stuck full of pieces of bone, and in the hand a grasped club, which they occasionally brandish with the greatest fierceness and agility. Some dances are performed by men only, some by women only, and in others the sexes mingle. In one of them I have seen the men drop on their hands and knees, and kiss the earth with the greatest fervour. Between the kisses, looking up to heaven, they also frequently throw up their arms, exactly in the manner in which the dances of the Friendly Islands are depicted, in one of the plates of Mr. Cook's last voyage. Courtship here, as in other countries, is generally promoted by this exercise, where every one tries to recommend himself to attention and applause. Dancing not only proves an incentive, but offers an opportunity in its intervals. The first advances are made by the men, who strive to render themselves agreeable to their favourites, by presents of fishing tackle and other articles which they know will prove acceptable. Generally speaking, a man has but one wife, but infidelity on the side of the husband with the unmarried girls is very frequent. For the most part, perhaps, they intermarry in their respective tribes. This rule is not, however, constantly observed, and there is reason to think that a more than ordinary share of courtship and presence on the part of the man is required in this case. Such difficulty seldom operates in extinguished desire, and nothing is more common than for the unsuccessful suitor to ravish by force that which he cannot accomplish by entreaty. I do not believe that very near connections by blood ever cohabit. We knew of no instance of it, but indeed the women in all respects treated with savage barbarity, condemned not only to carry the children, but all other burthens. They meet in return for submission only with blows, kicks, and every mark of brutality. When an Indian is provoked by a woman, he either spears her or knocks her down on the spot. On this occasion, he always strikes on the head, using indiscriminately a hatchet, a club, or any other weapon, which may chance to be in his hand. The heads of the women are always consequently seen in the state which I found that of Guridiana. Colby, who was certainly in other respects a good-tempered merry fellow, made no scruple of treating Daringa, who was a gentle creature, thus. Banilon did the same to Barangaroo, but she was a scold and a vixen, and nobody pitied her. It must nevertheless be confessed that the women often artfully study to irritate and inflame the passions of the men, although sensible that the consequence will alight on themselves. Many a matrimonial scene of this sort have I witnessed. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, in her sprightly letters from Turkey, longs for some of the advocates for passion, obedience, and unconditional submission, then existing in England, to be present at sights exhibited in a despotic government. 1,000 times, in like manner, have I wished that those European philosophers, whose closet speculations exalt a state of nature above a state of civilization, could survey the phantom which their heated imaginations have raised. Possibly they might then learn that a state of nature is, of all others, least adapted to promote the happiness of a being, capable of sublime research and unending ratiocination. That a savage, roaming for prey amidst his native deserts, is a creature deformed by all those passions which afflict and degrade our nature, unsoftened by the influence of religion, philosophy, and legal restriction, and that the more men unite their talents, the more closely the bands of society are drawn, and civilization advanced. Inasmuch is human felicity augmented, and man fitted for his unalienable station in the universe. Of the language of New South Wales, I once hoped to have subjoined to this work such an exposition as should have attracted public notice, and have excited public esteem, but the abrupt departure of Mr. Dawes, who, stimulated equally by curiosity and philanthropy, had hardly set foot on his native country, when he again quitted it, to encounter new perils in the service of the Sierra Leone Company, precludes me from executing this part of my original intention, in which he had promised to cooperate with me, and in which he had advanced his researches beyond the reach of competition. The few remarks which I can offer shall be concisely detailed. We were at first inclined to stigmatize this language as harsh and barbarous in its sounds. Their combinations of words, in the manner they utter them, frequently convey such an effect. But if not only the proper names of men and places, but many of their phrases, and a majority of their words, be simply and unconnectedly considered, they will be found to abound with vowels, and to produce sounds sometimes mellifluous and sometimes sonorous. What ear can object to the names of Colby, pronounced exactly as Colby is with us? Beriwan, Bondel, Imirawanyi, Didora, Wallawarawi, or Banilong among the men, or to Wiriwia, Guridiana, Milba, or Matilba among the women. Side note: Mrs. Johnson, wife of the chaplain of the settlement, was so pleased with this name, Milba, that she christened her little girl, born in Port Jackson, Milba Maria Johnson. Back to the main text. Parramatta, Guia, Camira, Caddy, and Mimel are names of places. The tribes derive their appellations from the places they inhabit. Thus, Camiragal means the men who reside in the Bay of Camira. Cadigal, those who reside in the Bay of Cadi, and so of the others. The women of the tribe are denoted by adding yan to any of the foregoing words. A Cadigalian imports a woman living at Cadi, or of the tribe of Cadigal. These words, as the reader will observe, are accented either on the first syllable or the penultima. In general, however, they are partial to the emphasis being laid as near the beginning of the word as possible. Of compound words they seem fond. Two very striking ones appear in the journal to the Hawkesbury. Their translations of our words into their language are always apposite, comprehensive, and drawn from images familiar to them. A gun, for instance, they call guru bira, that is, a stick of fire. Sometimes also, by a license of language, they call those who carry guns by the same name, but the appellation by which they generally distinguished us was that of biriwolga, meaning men come from afar. When they salute anyone they call him damili, or namesake, a term which not only implies courtesy and goodwill, but a certain degree of affection in the speaker. An interchange of names with anyone is also a symbol of friendship. Each person has several names, one of which, there is reason to believe, is always derived from the first fish or animal which the child, in accompanying its father to the chase, or a fishing, may chance to kill. Not only their combinations, but some of their simple sounds, were difficult of pronunciation to mouths purely English. Diphthongs often occur. One of the most common is that of a-e, or perhaps ai, pronounced not unlike those letters in the French verb haïr, to hate. The letter y frequently follows d in the same syllable. Thus the word which signifies a woman is gin, although the structure of our language requires us to spell it din. But if they sometimes put us to difficulty, many of our words were to them unutterable. The letters S and V they never could pronounce. The latter become invariably W, and the former mocked all their efforts, which in the instance of Banilon has been noticed. And a more unfortunate defect in learning our language could not easily be pointed out. They use the ellipses in speaking very freely, always omitting as many words as they possibly can, consistent with being understood. They inflect both their nouns and verbs regularly, and denote the cases of the former and the tenses of the latter, not like the English by auxiliary words, but like the Latins by change of termination. Their nouns, whether substantive or adjective, seem to admit of no plural. I have heard Mr. Dawes hint his belief of their using a dual number, similar to the Greeks, but I confess that I never could remark aught to confirm it. The method by which they answer a question that they cannot resolve is similar to what we sometimes use. Let, for example, the following question be put. Wa Colby Yagunu. Where is Colby today? Wa Ba. Where indeed, would be the reply. They use a direct and positive negative, but express the affirmative by a nod of the head or an inclination of the body. Opinions have greatly differed whether or not their language be copious. In one particular, it is notoriously defective. They cannot count with precision more than 4. However, as far as 10, by holding up the fingers, they can both comprehend others and explain themselves. Beyond 4, every number is called great, and should it happen to be very large, great, which is an Italian idiom also. This occasions their computations of time and space to be very confused and incorrect. Of the former, they have no measure but the visual diurnal motion of the sun, of the monthly revolution of the moon. To conclude the history of a people for whom I cannot but feel some share of affection, let those who have been born in more favoured lands, and who have profited by more enlightened systems, compassionate, but not despise their destitute and obscure situation. Children of the same omniscient paternal care, let them recollect that by the fortuitous advantage of birth alone, they possess superiority. That untaught, unaccommodated man is the same in Pall Mall as in the wilderness of New South Wales, and ultimately let them hope and trust that the progress of reason and the splendour of revelation will in their proper and allotted season be permitted to illumine and transfuse into these desert regions knowledge, virtue, and happiness. Chapter 18. Observations on the Convicts. A short account of that class of men for whose disposal and advantage the colony was principally, if not totally, founded, seems necessary. If it be recollected how large a body of these people are now congregated in the settlement of Port Jackson and at Norfolk Island, it will, I think, not only excite surprise, but afford satisfaction to learn that in a period of 4 years few crimes of a deep dye or of a hardened nature have been perpetrated. Murder and unnatural sins rank not hitherto in the catalogue of their enormities, and one suicide only has been committed. To the honour of the female part of our community, let it be recorded that only one woman has suffered capital punishment. On her condemnation, she pleaded pregnancy, and a jury of venerable matrons was impanelled on the spot to examine and pronounce her state, which the forewoman, a grave personage between 60 and 70 years old, did by this short address to the court: Gentlemen, she is as much with child as I am. Sentence was accordingly passed, and she was executed. Besides the instance of Irving, 2 other male convicts, William Bloodsworth of Kingston upon Thames and John Ascot of Truro in Cornwall, were both emancipated for their good conduct, and the years 1790 and 1791. Several men whose terms of transportation had expired, and against whom no legal impediment existed to prevent their departure, have been permitted to enter in merchant ships wanting hands, and as my Rose Hill journals testify, many others have had grants of land assigned to them, and are become settlers in the country. In so numerous a community, many persons of perverted genius and of mechanical ingenuity could not be but assembled. Let me produce the following example. Fraser was an iron manufacturer, bred at Sheffield, of whose abilities as a workman we had witnessed many proofs. The governor had written to England for a set of locks to be sent out for the security of the public stores, which were to be so constructed as to be incapable of being picked. On their arrival, His Excellency sent for Fraser, and bade him examine them, telling him at the same time that they could not be picked. Fraser laughed, and asked for a crooked nail only to open them all. A nail was brought, and in an instant he verified his assertion. Astonished at his dexterity, a gentleman present determined to put it to further point. He was sent for in a hurry, some days after, to the hospital, where a lock of still superior intricacy and expense to the others had been provided. He was told that the key was lost, and that the lock must be immediately picked. He examined it attentively, remarked that it was the production of a workman, and demanded 10 minutes to make an instrument to speak with it. Without carrying the lock with him, he went directly to his shop, and at the expiration of his term returned, applied his instrument, and open flew the lock. But it was not only in this part of his business that he excelled. He executed every branch of it in superior style. Had not his villainy been still more notorious than his skill, he would have proved an invaluable possession to a new country. He had passed through innumerable scenes in life, and had played many parts. When too lazy to work at his trade, he had turned thief into 50 different shapes, was a receiver of stolen goods, a soldier, and a travelling conjurer. He once confessed to me that he had made a set of tools for a gang of coiners, every man of whom was hanged. Were a nature of the subject worthy of further illustration, many similar proofs of misapplied talents might be adduced. The love of the marvellous has been recorded in early part of this work. The imposture of the Goldfinger, however prominent and glaring, nevertheless contributed to awakening attention and to create merriment. He enjoyed the reputation of a discoverer until experiment detected the imposition. But others were less successful to acquire even monetary admiration. The execution of forgery seems to demand at least neatness of imitation, and dexterity of address. On the arrival of the first fleet of ships from England, several convicts brought out recommendatory letters from different friends. Of these, some were genuine, and many owed their birth to the ingenuity of the bearers. But these last were all such bungling performances as to produce only instant detection and succeeding contempt. One of them, addressed to the governor, with the name of Baron Hotham affixed to it, began, "Honoured Sir." A leading distinction which marked the convicts on their outset in the colony was a use of what is called the flash, or kiddie language. In some of our early courts of justice, an interpreter was frequently necessary to translate the disposition of the witness and the defence of the prisoner. This language has many dialects: the sly dexterity of the pickpocket, the brutal ferocity of the footpad, the more elevated career of the highwayman, and the deadly purpose of the midnight ruffian, is each strictly appropriate in the terms which distinguish and characterize it. I have ever been of opinion that an abolition of this unnatural jargon would open the path to reformation, and my observations on these people have constantly instructed me that indulgence in this infatuation cant is more deeply associated with depravity and continuance in vice than is generally supposed. I recollect hardly one instance of a return to honest pursuits and habits of industry where this miserable perversion of our noblest and peculiar faculty was not previously conquered. Those persons to whom the inspection and management of our numerous and extensive prisons in England are committed will perform a service to society by attending to the foregoing observation. Let us always keep in view that punishment, when not directed to promote reformation, is arbitrary and unauthorized. Chapter 19. Facts relating to the probability of establishing a whale fishery on the coast of New South Wales, with thoughts on the same. In every former part of this publication, I have studiously avoided mentioning a whale fishery, as the information relating to it will, I conceive, be more acceptably received in this form by those to whom it is addressed, than if mingled with other matter. Previous to entering on this detail, it must be observed that several of the last fleet of ships which had arrived from England with convicts were fitted out with implements for whale fishing, and were intended to sail for the coast of Brazil to pursue the fishery immediately on having landed the convicts. On the 14th of October 1791, the Britannia, Captain Melville, one of these ships, arrived at Sydney. In her passage between Van Diemen's Land and Port Jackson, the master reported that he had seen a large shoal of spermaceti whales. His words were, "I saw more whales at one time around my ship than in the whole of 6 years which I have fished on the coast of Brazil." This intelligence was no sooner communicated than all the whalers were eager to push to sea. Melville himself was among the most early, and on the 10th of November returned to Port Jackson more confident of success than before. He assured me that in the 14 days which he had been out, he had seen more spermaceti whales than in all his former life. They amounted, he said, to many thousands, most of them of enormous magnitude, and had he not met with bad weather, he could have killed as many as he pleased. 7 he did kill, but owing to the stormy, agitated state of the water, he could not get any of them aboard. In one, however, which is a momentary interval of calm, was killed and secured by a ship in company he shared. The oil and head matter of this fish he extolled as of an extraordinary fine quality. He was of the opinion the former would fetch £10 per ton more in London than that procured on the Brazil coast. He had not gone further south than 37 degrees, and described the latitude of 35 degrees to be the place where the whales most abounded, just on the edge of soundings, which here extends about 15 leagues from the shore. 15 leagues is about 83 kilometres, though perhaps on other parts of the coast the bank will be found to run hardly so far off. On the following day, November 11th, the Mary Ann, Captain Munro, another of the whalers, returned into port. After having been out 16 days, she had gone as far south as 41 degrees, but saw not a whale, and had met with a tremendously bad weather, in which she had shipped a sea that had set her boiling coppers afloat, and had nearly carried them overboard. November 22nd, the William and Anne, Captain Bunker, returned, after having been more than 3 weeks out and putting into Broken Bay. This is the ship that had killed the fish in which Melville shared. Bunker had met with no further success, owing, he said, entirely to gales of wind, for he had seen several immense shoals, and was of opinion that he should have secured 50 tons of oil, had the weather been tolerably moderate. I asked him whether he thought the whales he had seen were fish of passage. No, he answered. They were going on every point of the compass, and were evidently on feeding ground, which I saw no reason to doubt that they frequent. Melville afterwards confirmed to me this observation. December 3rd, the Mary Ann and Matilda again returned. The former had gone to the southward, and off Port Jarvis had fallen in with 2 shoals of whales, 9 of which were killed, but owing to bad weather, part of 5 only were got on board, as much the master computed as would yield 30 barrels of oil. He said the whales were at least shy of any he had ever seen, not having been cut up, a fisherman's phrase for harassed, disturbed. The latter had gone to the northward, and had seen no whales, but a few finbacks. On the 5th of December, both these ships sailed again, and on the 16th and 17th of the month, just before the author sailed for England, they and the Britannia and William and Anne returned to Port Jackson without success. Having experienced a continuation of the bad weather and seen very few fish, they all said that their intention was to give the coast one more trial, and if it miscarried, to quit it and steer to the northward in search of less tempestuous seas. The only remark which I have to offer to adventurers on the above subject is not to suffer discouragement by concluding that bad weather only is to be found on the coast of New South Wales, where the whales have hitherto been seen. The tempests happen sometimes there, as in other seas, but let them feel assured that there are in every month of the year many days in which the whale fisheries may be safely carried on. The evidence of the abundance in which the spermaceti whales are sometimes seen is incontrovertible. That which speaks to their being not fish of passage is at least respectable and hitherto uncontradicted. The prospect merits attention, may stimulate to enterprise. The 2 discoveries of Port Jarvis and Matilda Bay, which are to be found in the foregoing sheets, may yet be wanting in the maps of the coast. My account of their geographic situation, except possibly in the exact longitude of the latter, a point not very material, may be safely depended upon. A knowledge of Oyster Bay, discovered and laid down by the Mercury store ship in the year 1789, would also be desirable, but this I am incapable of furnishing. Here terminates my subject. Content with the humble province of detailing facts and connecting events by undisturbed narration, I leave to others the task of anticipating glorious or gloomy consequences from the establishment of a colony, which unquestionably demands serious investigation, either its prosecution or abandonment be determined. But doubtless not only those who planned, but those who have been delegated to execute an enterprise of such magnitude have deeply revolved that great national expense does not imply the necessity of national suffering, while revenue is employed with success to some valuable end. The profits of every adventure being more than sufficient to repay its costs, the public should gain, and its resources should continue to multiply. But an expense, whether sustained at home or abroad, whether a waste of the present or an anticipation of the future revenue, if it bring no adequate return, is to be reckoned among the causes of national ruin. Side note, Ferguson's essay on the history of civil society. Back to the main text. The end. That was the final chapters of the book called A Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson by Watkin Tench. I hope this book piqued your interest in the views of worlds colliding. Until next time, I wish you well.